Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel for a rainy night. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now let's get started. I've been a long-haul truck driver for almost 2 decades, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. Empty stretches of highway at night can play tricks on your mind, especially when you're running on caffeine and not enough sleep. But there's one night that still haunts me, and it's not something I can just chalk up to fatigue or an overactive imagination. It was real, and it changed the way I see those lonely highways forever. I was driving through the Nevada desert, hauling a load of auto parts on a route I'd done countless times before. It was the dead of night, the sky moonless and pitch black, with only my headlights cutting through the darkness. There wasn't another car in sight, just an endless ribbon of road and the occasional distant silhouette of a cactus or boulder. I had the radio on low, just enough to keep me company without distracting me. I was making good time and hoped to reach the next rest stop before my mandatory break. That's when I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road, right at the edge of my headlights, her thumb outstretched in the classic hitchhiker pose. She looked young, maybe in her 20s, with long, dark hair and a tattered-looking backpack slung over her shoulder. Normally I wouldn't pick up hitchhikers, especially not in the middle of nowhere. But something about her made me slow down. Maybe it was the way she was staring straight at me, like she'd been waiting just for me. Or maybe it was the look in her eyes, desperate, almost pleading. Against my better judgment, I pulled over and rolled down the passenger window. She approached cautiously, her face illuminated by the glow of my interior lights. She looked exhausted, her clothes dusty and her eyes sunken. But she managed a faint smile. "Where are you headed?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Anywhere," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just away from here." I hesitated, but the loneliness in her voice tugged at something in me. I nodded and unlocked the door. She climbed in, and I caught a whiff of something odd, damp earth and something metallic, like old blood. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was probably the desert air and the grime from the road. As we drove, she didn't say much. She just stared out the window, her hands gripping her backpack like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. I tried making small talk, asking where she was from and where she was going, but she only answered in short, vague responses. Something about being lost, trying to get home, but she never mentioned where home was. After a while, I gave up on conversation and focused on the road, but the air in the cab felt heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced at her every so often, and each time I did, she seemed to be staring at me out of the corner of her eye. It was subtle, but enough to make my skin crawl. We drove in silence for about an hour, the radio humming softly in the background. I kept checking the clock, eager to reach the next rest stop, but the miles seemed to drag on endlessly. The desert outside looked the same no matter how far we went, an endless barren landscape that swallowed the road in every direction. Then she spoke, breaking the silence so suddenly that I jumped. "Do you believe in ghosts?" she asked, her voice barely louder than a whisper. I laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "I've seen some weird things out here, but I don't know about ghosts." She turned to look at me, and in the dim light of the dashboard I saw something shift in her expression. Her eyes seemed darker, hollow, and her skin looked almost translucent, like she was fading away. "They say the desert is full of them," she continued, her voice taking on a strange, distant quality. "People who got lost, who never found their way out. They're still wandering, looking for a ride that will take them home." A chill ran down my spine. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to ignore the growing unease that was settling in my gut. "Yeah, well, let's hope we're not picking up any of them tonight," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out shaky. She didn't respond, Instead, she just turned her gaze back to the window, her reflection flickering in the glass. For a moment, I thought I saw something else in the reflection. Another face, twisted and grim, staring back at me from her side of the cab. I blinked, and it was gone. Just her reflection again, pale and still. I kept driving, the rest stop still nowhere in sight. It was like the road was stretching out in front of us, refusing to let us reach our destination. I checked the clock again, but the time hadn't changed. It was stuck at 2:47 a.m., the digital numbers frozen in place. Panic started to claw at my mind. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. I glanced over at her again, and that's when I noticed. She wasn't casting a shadow. The headlights were bright enough to cast shadows from everything else in the cab, but she had none. It was as if the light passed right through her. My heart pounded in my chest as I swerved the truck to the side of the road and slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched against the pavement, and the truck came to a shuddering halt. I turned to her, my breath ragged, and she was just sitting there calm, staring straight ahead. "You need to get out," I said, my voice trembling. She slowly turned her head to face me, her eyes locking onto mine. There was no anger, no fear, just a deep, endless sadness. "Please," she whispered, her voice echoing in my ears. "I just want to go home." I reached over and opened the passenger door, my hand shaking. She climbed out without a word, her feet barely making a sound as they touched the pavement. She stood there, watching me, her figure fading into the darkness of the desert. I slammed the door shut and took off, my tires kicking up dust as I sped down the highway. I didn't look back, didn't dare check the mirrors. I just drove, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, my heart pounding in my ears. It wasn't until I reached the rest stop that I finally pulled over, my hands still gripping the wheel so tightly that they ached. I sat there for a long time trying to catch my breath, to calm the racing of my heart. The clock on the dash flickered and finally resumed, ticking over to 3 a.m. I got out of the truck and walked around to the passenger side, half expecting to find her standing there, waiting. But there was nothing, just the empty highway stretching out into the darkness. I never saw her again, but I've heard stories from other drivers. Stories about a girl on the side of the road, always in the same spot, always with that same desperate look in her eyes. Some say she was a runaway who got lost in the desert. Others say she was a victim of a hitchhiker herself, left to wander the roads forever. But the strangest part? A few weeks after that night, I was cleaning out my truck and found something wedged between the seat and the door. A tattered old backpack covered in dust. I opened it and found a few clothes, a water bottle, and a worn photo of a young woman with long, dark hair. It was her. I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore, and I avoid that stretch of highway whenever I can. But sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm alone on the road, I think I hear her voice again, faint and distant, calling from the darkness. And I can't shake the feeling that she's still out there, waiting for someone to finally take her home. I've always loved the outdoors, hiking, camping, exploring. There's something about being surrounded by nature that feels like a reset button for my mind. That's why, when I got the chance to spend a long weekend at Cedar Pine National Park, I jumped at it. It was the kind of remote, off-the-grid place that promised serenity with miles of unspoiled trails and the chance to disconnect from everything. I arrived early on a Friday morning, the mist still clinging to the trees. There were a few other cars in the parking lot, but I didn't see any other hikers as I set off down the main trail. The air was cool, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. It felt like I had the whole park to myself, which was exactly what I wanted. After a few hours of hiking, I decided to take a less traveled path that branched off from the main trail. It wasn't marked on the map, but I figured it was just an old ranger's path or a forgotten trail. The further I went, the quieter the forest became. The birds stopped singing, and the rustling of animals in the underbrush faded away. It was just me, the crunch of leaves under my boots, and the occasional creak of the trees swaying in the breeze. I should have turned back then, but something about the path pulled me forward. The trail narrowed, the trees growing denser, their branches intertwining overhead like a canopy that blocked out the sun. The deeper I went, the more overgrown the trail became until it was barely distinguishable from the rest of the forest floor. After about an hour of walking, I stumbled upon something that stopped me in my tracks. A rusted old sign, half buried in the undergrowth. I wiped away the dirt, revealing faded words. Cedar Pine Village, 1 mile. I'd never heard of a village in the park, and it wasn't on any of the maps I'd studied. Curious, I decided to keep going. Maybe it was some old ghost town or a long-forgotten settlement. The trail wound deeper into the woods, and I began to feel uneasy. The trees seemed older here, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The air was heavy, filled with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As I pushed through a dense thicket, I finally saw it, what was left of Cedar Pine Village. It wasn't much, just a few crumbling wooden structures half swallowed by the forest. Moss and vines covered what remained of the walls, and the windows were dark and empty. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. It was as if the forest itself had taken the village back, erasing any trace of the people who had once lived there. I walked through the village, taking in the remnants of a time long past. There was an old well, its stone walls crumbling, and a few rusted tools scattered in the dirt. I found a small building that looked like it had been a schoolhouse, the blackboard still faintly visible through the rotted walls. But there was no sign of what had happened to the villagers, no plaques or markers to explain why the place had been abandoned. As I explored, I noticed something strange. There were no signs of animals, no birds, no insects, nothing. It was as if all life had abandoned the place. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I started to feel like I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone around. That's when I found the tree. It was enormous, towering above the village like a guardian. Its trunk was wider than any I'd ever seen, its bark dark and knotted. But what caught my attention were the carvings, dozens of them, etched deep into the bark. Symbols, names, and strange patterns that I couldn't make sense of. Some were faded and worn, while others looked fresh, like they'd been carved recently. I ran my fingers over the carvings, trying to decipher their meaning, when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty village and the dense wall of trees. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the footsteps continued, circling me, growing louder. I backed away from the tree, my heart racing. As I did, I noticed something that sent chills down my spine. The ground around the tree was covered in footprints, hundreds of them crisscrossing in every direction. Some were old, barely visible in the dirt, but others were fresh, like someone had been walking there just moments before. I decided I'd had enough. I turned to leave, but the path I'd come down was gone. The forest had swallowed it up, leaving nothing but a tangle of underbrush and trees. Panic set in as I realized I was lost. I tried to retrace my steps, but every turn led me deeper into the woods, the village always just out of sight, like it was shifting, moving with me. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows that twisted and moved as if alive. I could still hear the footsteps, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but never stopping. And then I heard something else, a soft whispering, like the rustling of leaves, but with a deliberate, almost human cadence. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, insistent. I stumbled through the woods, trying to find any sign of the trail, but the forest seemed endless, the trees closing in around me. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw a light, a faint, flickering glow in the distance. It was coming from the village. I approached cautiously, the light growing brighter as I neared. It was coming from the schoolhouse. I peered through the broken window and saw a candle burning on the floor, its flame dancing in the darkness. Next to it was a figure, hunched and unmoving, carved into the wall with the same strange symbols I'd seen on the tree. But it wasn't just a carving, it was Jess. She was standing perfectly still, her eyes wide open but unseeing, her skin pale and waxy like she'd been there for years. Her hands were pressed against the wall, her fingers tracing the carvings as if in a trance. I called out to her, but she didn't respond, didn't even blink. It was as if she was part of the wall, bound to it. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This was impossible. Jess had disappeared over a year ago, miles away from here. I turned to run, but the village had changed again. The buildings were closer, the walls leaning in like they were trying to trap me. I could hear the whispering growing louder, more frantic, and the footsteps closing in. I ran blindly through the trees, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. The forest seemed to shift and bend around me, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes. I could feel the ground shifting under my feet, like it was trying to swallow me whole. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I broke through the tree line and stumbled into the parking lot. The sun was just dipping below the horizon, casting everything in an eerie twilight. I collapsed against my car, gasping for breath, my mind spinning. I looked back, but the path I had taken was gone, replaced by a solid wall of trees. The village, the tree, Jess. It was all gone, like it had never been there. I climbed into my car and drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away from the park. I reported what I'd seen to the rangers, but they found nothing. No village, no carvings, no footprints, just untouched forest, as if I'd imagined the whole thing. But I know what I saw, and every now and then, when I'm alone in the quiet of the night, I can still hear the whispering, faint but insistent, calling me back to the village that doesn't exist on any map. And sometimes in the distance, I hear footsteps following me, echoing through the trees, never stopping, always watching. When I was growing up, my grandmother always warned me about the house that calls. It was a story she'd tell us kids whenever we got too close to the old crumbling house at the end of our street. No one lived there anymore. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. The roof sagged, the windows were boarded up, and weeds choked the front yard. But every so often, you'd hear stories about someone who went inside and never came back. "They say the house calls to you," Grandma would whisper, her voice low and serious. "Once you step inside, it won't let you leave." I thought it was just a tale to keep us from playing in a dangerous old building. But then, about a month ago, my friend Jess went missing. We were close, like sisters, and her disappearance left a hole that nothing seemed to fill. The last time I saw her, she'd been acting strange, distracted, like she was hearing something I couldn't. She'd kept glancing down the street, her eyes fixed on that old house. I never told anyone, but the day after Jess vanished, I swore I heard someone calling my name. It was soft, almost like a breeze whispering through the trees, but distinct enough to send a chill down my spine. I brushed it off, thinking it was my mind playing tricks on me. But the next night I heard it again, clearer this time. A faint, far-off voice calling, "Come see." It didn't sound like Jess, but there was something familiar about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know if she was there. So one Friday evening, when the sun was dipping low and casting long shadows, I stood in front of that house. The front door, usually closed tight, was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. My heart pounded as I took a step closer, the boards creaking underfoot. I hesitated, remembering Grandma's warning, but then I thought of Jess. What if she was inside? What if she needed me? I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was heavy, musty, and cold. Dust hung in the sunlight like tiny, suspended stars. The floor was littered with broken furniture and the remnants of lives long forgotten. I called out Jess's name, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. I took a few cautious steps forward, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. There was no sign of anyone, just the sense that the house was holding its breath, watching me. As I moved deeper into the house, I heard it again, the voice calling, "Come see." It was clearer now, coming from upstairs. I hesitated at the bottom of the staircase, the wood creaking ominously under my weight. The air grew colder as I climbed, each step feeling like a step away from safety. The second floor was a maze of narrow hallways and peeling wallpaper. I followed the voice to a room at the end of the hall, its door hanging off its hinges. Inside, there was nothing but an old mirror propped against the wall. It was large and ornate, the glass speckled with age. I could see my reflection, warped and shadowed, staring back at me. But then in the corner of the mirror I saw her, Jess. She was standing just behind me, her eyes wide and pleading. I spun around, but the room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, and she was still there, mouthing words I couldn't hear. My breath fogged the glass as I stepped closer, trying to make out what she was saying. Then I heard it again, that voice, only this time it was coming from the mirror, not from behind me. It wasn't Jess's voice. It was deeper, echoing, like multiple voices speaking at once. "Stay," it said, a command more than a request. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The reflection in the mirror shifted, the room behind me blurring and darkening, as if the mirror was showing a different place, a different time. Shadows twisted and writhed behind Jess, shapes moving just out of focus. She reached out, her hand pressing against the glass from the other side, her eyes filled with desperation. I felt a pull like something was tugging at my very essence, trying to drag me closer to the mirror. My vision blurred, the room spinning. I could hear that voice in my head now, louder and more insistent. "Stay with us." I fought against it, pulling myself away, my feet stumbling over the debris on the floor. I made it back to the hallway, gasping for breath, and slammed the door shut behind me. The voice stopped, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, didn't. I raced down the stairs, not stopping until I was outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap. I turned to look back at the house, half expecting to see Jess or something else staring out at me. But the windows were dark, and the door was shut tight. I never went back inside, and I never heard the voice again. But that night, I had a dream. I was standing in front of that mirror, only this time, I wasn't alone. The room was full of people, shadowy figures with hollow eyes, their faces twisted in silent screams. Jess was among them, her hand still pressed against the glass, trapped. The next morning, I called Grandma and told her everything. She listened quietly, then said, "The house takes what it wants. It calls to those who are lost, who are searching for something. Once you hear it, it's hard to ignore. But it's never really them calling, not really." I tried to forget about the house, about the mirror, but it's always there, at the back of my mind. I moved away from that town, far from the street where the house still stands, its windows dark and empty. But sometimes, in the quiet moments just before sleep, I think I hear that faint whisper, calling my name, asking me to come back, to see. I keep my mirrors covered now just in case, but there's always that nagging fear that one day I might catch a glimpse of Jess behind the glass, still waiting, still trapped. And I know deep down that the house is still calling, waiting for someone to listen. The hotel looked normal enough from the outside. A bit run down, sure, but I was desperate. I'd been driving for hours on that lonely stretch of highway, and the storm had come out of nowhere, turning the roads into slick rivers of black. The neon sign flickered in the rain. The Wayfarer Inn. It seemed like a lifeline, a place to wait out the worst of the weather. Inside, the lobby was empty, save for a bored-looking clerk behind the desk. He barely glanced up as I walked in, shaking rain from my jacket. The place smelled of mildew and old carpet, but it was warm, and that was good enough for me. "Just need a room for the night," I said, digging into my pocket for my wallet. The clerk, a wiry man with a thin mustache and eyes that seemed too big for his face, looked at me for the first time. His gaze was unsettling, like he was trying to see past my skin. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the counter. "Room 9, he said finally, sliding a key across the desk. Top of the stairs, end of the hall. I nodded, took the key, and headed up the creaky staircase. The place was old. Every step I took echoed through the walls, and the dim lighting flickered intermittently. As I reached the top of the stairs, I glanced down the long, narrow hallway. It stretched further than seemed possible, given the size of the building. But it was late, I was tired, and I chalked it up to poor lighting and my own exhaustion. I found room 9 at the very end, just as the clerk had said. The door was slightly ajar, which was odd, but I figured housekeeping had been sloppy. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was basic: a bed, a small dresser, a TV bolted to the wall, and a single window overlooking the empty parking lot below. I tossed my bag onto the bed and sat down, rubbing my temples. The rain pounded against the glass, the wind howling like a distant scream. I switched on the TV for some background noise, but all it picked up was static. Typical, I thought, setting the remote aside. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I noticed it. The feeling that I wasn't alone. It was subtle at first, just a prickling on the back of my neck. But it grew stronger, more insistent. I sat up, scanning the room, but everything was as it should be. Just an empty, drab hotel room. I laughed at myself, shaking off the nerves. It was just the storm, the isolation, the way the wind rattled the windows. I lay back down, closing my eyes, and tried to sleep. That's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the other side of the wall. I turned my head toward the sound, frowning. It was slow, deliberate, like someone gently knocking. I told myself it was just the pipes or maybe a tree branch against the outside wall, but the sound continued, growing louder, closer. I got up and pressed my ear to the wall. The tapping stopped instantly, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, pleading. I backed away, my skin crawling. I turned on all the lights, the TV, anything to drown out the sound, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to go back downstairs, maybe ask the clerk about the room next door, see if anyone else had complained about the noise. But when I stepped out into the hallway, I froze. The corridor was longer now, much longer. It stretched on endlessly, the light at the far end dim and distant. The door to my room was the only one on this side, but I could see other doors, hundreds of them, lining the walls all the way down. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, but the hallway remained impossibly long, stretching into a darkness that seemed to breathe. I turned to go back into my room, but the door had closed behind me, and when I tried the handle, it was locked. Panic surged through me, and I banged on the door, shouting for help. But the sound was swallowed by the endless corridor. There was no way this was real. I had to be dreaming, hallucinating. Something. I started walking down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I passed door after door, all of them identical, all of them closed. Each had a small tarnished number plate, but the numbers made no sense. 13, 57, 28, 101. They seemed random, as if the doors were shifting, rearranging themselves as I walked. Finally, I stopped in front of one marked 9999. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out into the hall. I hesitated, my heart hammering in my chest, but I couldn't stay in that hallway forever. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was exactly like mine. Same bed, same TV, same window, looking out onto the same rain-soaked parking lot. But there was something different, something off. The air was heavy, like it was pressing down on me, and the shadows seemed to move just at the edge of my vision. On the bed sat a suitcase. My suitcase. My heart sank as I approached it, flipping it open. Inside were my clothes, my phone, my wallet, all exactly as I'd left them. I stumbled back, the room spinning around me. This was impossible. I was sure I'd locked my room before I left. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me, and sprinted down the hallway. But no matter how far I ran, the corridor stretched on, the doors multiplying, the numbers shifting. I was trapped in a labyrinth with no end, no exit. I stopped, panting, and leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. That's when I saw him, the clerk, standing at the far end of the hallway watching me. His expression was blank, his eyes dark and unblinking. I called out to him, relief flooding my voice, but he just turned and walked through a door marked Ao Zero, disappearing into the darkness. Desperation clawed at me. I ran to the door, throwing it open, but the room beyond was empty. Just another identical room, with the same bed, the same window, the same unrelenting rain. I fell to my knees, my mind fraying at the edges. There was no way out. The rooms, the hallways, they just kept looping, twisting, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I don't know how long I wandered, hours, days, it all blurred together. I stopped counting doors, stopped checking the numbers. They didn't matter anymore. I was lost in a place that shouldn't exist, a place that defied reason. And then, one day or night, I couldn't tell anymore. I found myself back at the lobby. It was exactly as I had left it. The same worn carpet, the same flickering neon sign outside. The clerk was there, sitting at the desk, a knowing smile on his thin lips. "You finally made it," he said, his voice calm as if he'd been expecting me. "Where am I?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "What is this place?" He shrugged, glancing at the guest book on the counter. "It's where people end up when they're running from something. It's easy to get in, not so easy to leave." I stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. "I didn't come here to hide," I said, my voice shaking. "I just needed a place to stay." He looked up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. "Everyone's hiding from something," he said quietly. "Even if it's just themselves." I turned to leave, to run out into the rain, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing but darkness. No parking lot, no road, just an endless void. I felt the floor shift beneath me, the lobby stretching and twisting, the walls bending inward like the place was alive. I turned back to the clerk, but he was gone, the desk empty. The lobby stretched into another hallway, more doors, more rooms that I knew would be exactly the same. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. I stopped at the next door, marked 1, and took a deep breath. I pushed it open, stepping inside, knowing I would find the same room waiting for me, the same bed, the same window, the same rain that never stopped. I don't know if I'll ever find a way out. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe this place is all there is now, the Wayfarer Inn, where every door leads to the same room, every room looks out onto the same endless night, and every hallway stretches on forever. And maybe, just maybe, it's not the inn that's trapping me here. Maybe it's something I brought with me, something I'll never escape. I always loved my grandmother's house. It was a quaint old Victorian at the end of a long, winding road, surrounded by towering oaks and a dense thicket of overgrown garden. Every summer my parents would drop me off for a week or two, and I would spend my days exploring the nooks and crannies of that rambling, creaky house. As a child, I was fascinated by the place. It was like stepping back in time. The antique furniture, the faded floral wallpaper, the dimly lit hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. But there was one room I was never allowed to enter, the attic. My grandmother kept it locked, and I was forbidden to go up there. I never questioned why. I just accepted it as one of those mysterious adult things I wasn't meant to understand. Years passed and I grew up, my visits becoming less frequent. Eventually, my grandmother passed away, and the house sat empty, collecting dust and memories. After she was gone, my parents debated selling it, but I couldn't bear the thought. It felt like losing her all over again. So I took a leave from work, packed my bags, and decided to spend a week cleaning the place up, hoping to hold on to that piece of my childhood. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. The house looked exactly the same, yet strangely different, like a photograph that had faded just a little too much. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of must and lavender greeting me, and I felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with sadness. The first few days were spent cleaning, sorting through old belongings, and reminiscing about the past. Everything was as I remembered except for one thing. The attic door was wide open. I stood there, staring up at the dark stairway, a shiver running down my spine. I hadn't been in the house for years, but I was certain the door had always been locked. I thought maybe my parents had opened it while clearing things out, but when I called to ask, they insisted they hadn't touched it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to finally see what was inside. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed up, the air growing colder with each step. The attic was dusty and dim, filled with old furniture, boxes, and a single small window that let in just enough light to cast eerie shadows across the floor. I wandered around, sifting through old photos and trinkets, feeling a bittersweet connection to the past. Then I saw it. An old, cracked mirror leaning against the far wall, its glass cloudy with age. As I approached, I noticed something odd, something that made my heart skip a beat. In the reflection, I could see the window, and standing just outside was the figure of a man. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but when I looked at the window, there was nothing there, just the overgrown garden and the darkening sky. I turned back to the mirror, and the man was gone. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination brought on by too many hours spent in the dusty attic. I brushed it off and went back downstairs, but the feeling of unease lingered. That night I lay in bed unable to sleep. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every creak and groan sound like a whisper. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the image of the man in the mirror, wondering who he was and why he had looked so real. Around midnight I heard it, a faint tapping at the window. I sat up, my pulse quickening, and stared into the darkness. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like someone knocking to be let in. I crept to the window, peering out into the yard, but there was no one there, just shadows and the rustle of leaves in the wind. I told myself it was a branch, nothing more, and went back to bed. But the tapping continued, night after night, always at the same time, always at the same window. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. One night, as the tapping grew louder, I decided to confront it. I grabbed a flashlight and threw open the window, shining the beam into the darkness. The light cut through the night, illuminating the empty yard, but there was no sign of anyone or anything that could have caused the noise. I slammed the window shut, frustrated and a little scared, and turned to go back to bed. That's when I saw him again. Standing in the hallway just outside the bedroom door was the man from the mirror. His face was still hidden in shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand, and for a long, agonizing moment we just stared at each other. Then he moved, stepping forward, his movement slow and deliberate. I backed away, my heart racing, and slammed the bedroom door shut, locking it behind me. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for footsteps, but all I heard was silence. I waited, my breath coming in ragged gasps until I was sure he was gone. The next morning I packed my bags and left, leaving the house behind without looking back. I told myself I would come back later, with friends or family, but I never did. I couldn't bring myself to set foot in that house again. A few months later, I finally convinced my parents to sell the place. The new owners moved in, a young couple with a baby on the way. I warned them about the attic, about the man in the window, but they just smiled politely, dismissing my concerns as the ramblings of a tired mind. A week after they moved in, I received a call from the new owner. She sounded scared, her voice trembling as she described what had happened. She had been putting away some boxes in the attic when she noticed the old mirror leaning against the wall. In the reflection, she saw a man standing at the window watching her. She turned around, but the room was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the man was still there, staring at her with those cold, unblinking eyes. She dropped the box and ran, slamming the attic door behind her. They moved out the next day. The house stands empty now, the windows dark and lifeless, but sometimes, when I drive past, I catch a glimpse of movement in the attic, a shadow just beyond the glass. A man in a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat, watching, waiting. And I realize with a shudder that the man wasn't outside the window that day in the attic. He was inside, staring back at me from the other side of the mirror. The call started at midnight, just after I moved into the apartment. At first I thought it was a mistake, a wrong number, some drunk dialing the old landline that came with the place. Who even has a landline anymore? But the apartment came with one, wired into the walls, a dusty relic of the 80s. It never rang except at midnight. The first night I was jolted awake by the shrill ring echoing through the empty room. I stumbled out of bed, half asleep, and picked up the receiver. The line crackled with static, and for a moment there was nothing but silence on the other end. Then a faint rhythmic breathing filled my ear. I hung up, annoyed but too groggy to care much. Wrong number, I thought, and went back to bed. The next night the call came again, midnight on the dot. This time I was awake, watching TV on the couch. The ring was loud, jarring, and I answered it with a mix of irritation and curiosity. Static again, followed by that same heavy breathing. I listened for a moment, expecting someone to speak, but there was only that unsettling, rhythmic sound. I hung up and disconnected the phone from the wall, figuring that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The following night, the phone rang again. Midnight. The same shrill tone, cutting through the silence of the apartment. My heart skipped a beat as I realized I hadn't plugged it back in. I approached the phone, the hairs on my neck standing up, and picked up the receiver. Static, louder this time, and beneath it, the faintest hint of a voice, whispering words I couldn't quite make out. I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking. I tried to rationalize it. Faulty wiring, maybe, or a prank. I called the building manager the next morning, a surly man named Frank who smelled like cigarettes and stale coffee. He shrugged when I told him about the calls. "Must be the old wiring," he said, barely glancing up from his crossword puzzle. "Place hasn't been renovated since the 80s. Could be picking up signals from anywhere." I asked him to disconnect the line, but he just shrugged again. "Sorry, can't do that. It's part of the building's infrastructure. Best you can do is unplug it." I left the office, frustrated but determined to ignore the calls. I unplugged the phone and shoved it into the closet, out of sight and out of mind. For a while it worked. A week passed without incident, and I almost forgot about the strange calls. But then on the 8th night it happened again. I woke up to the sound of the phone ringing, muffled but unmistakable, coming from the closet. My heart pounded as I fumbled for the light switch, my pulse thudding in my ears. I threw open the closet door, and there it was, the phone plugged in and ringing even though I knew I had unplugged it. I picked up the receiver, my hand trembling, and brought it to my ear. The static was deafening this time, hissing like a swarm of angry bees. And beneath it the whispering voice was clearer now, though still distorted like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I could make out a few words, repeated over and over, but they made no sense. "Help, can't, out." I dropped the phone, stumbling back, and it fell silent. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, and I could feel something watching me, something just out of sight. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat on the couch staring at the phone in the closet, waiting for it to ring again. It didn't. The next day I called a technician to come and inspect the line. He arrived in the afternoon, a friendly guy with a tool belt and a tired smile. He checked the wiring, fiddled with some connections, and finally shook his head. "There's nothing wrong with it," he said, sounding almost apologetic. "The line's clean. No interference, no crossed wires. It's just a phone." I thanked him, but I didn't feel relieved. If anything, his words made me more uneasy. I decided to get rid of the phone entirely, throwing it into the dumpster behind the building. I went to bed that night feeling a little better, convinced that the calls would stop now that the phone was gone. But at midnight, I woke up to the sound of ringing. It was faint, almost distant, but it was there, echoing through the walls like a forgotten melody. I lay there, frozen, my mind racing. I had thrown the phone away. There was no way it could still be ringing. I got up, moving through the dark apartment, following the sound. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, growing louder the closer I got to the bedroom closet. My hand hesitated on the doorknob, dread pooling in my stomach. I opened the door, half expecting to see the phone sitting on the shelf, but it was empty. The ringing stopped abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. That's when I saw it, a faint, wet handprint smeared on the inside of the closet door, like someone had pressed their palm against it from the inside. The print was small, child-sized, and as I stared at it, my breath caught in my throat. It was fresh, the moisture still glistening in the dim light. I stumbled back, slamming the closet door shut. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, all the lights on, clutching a baseball bat like it would somehow protect me from whatever was in that closet. I tried to leave the apartment the next morning, but the door wouldn't budge. The lock was jammed, the key twisting uselessly in my hand. I banged it on the walls, screamed for help, but no one came. My phone had no signal, the screen stuck on a loading icon that never completed. By noon, the air in the apartment grew heavy, like a storm was pressing in. I could hear faint whispers, skittering at the edges of my hearing, growing louder with each passing hour. I tried to block them out, to cover my ears, but they wormed their way into my mind, relentless and insistent. Midnight came, and the ringing returned. It was deafening now, vibrating through the walls, shaking the windows. I ran to the closet, threw open the door, and there it was, the phone sitting on the shelf, ringing and ringing, louder than ever before. I picked it up, screaming into the receiver, demanding to know who was there, what they wanted. The static roared in my ears, and then the voice came through, clear and unmistakable. "It's not you, it's me. I can't get out." The line went dead, and I stood there, the receiver still clutched in my hand. I dropped it, backing away from the closet, and that's when I saw it. The small, pale figure standing in the corner of the room watching me. A child, her face gaunt and sunken, her eyes wide with something between fear and rage. She pointed at the closet, her mouth moving soundlessly, her eyes pleading. And then she faded, like a shadow dissolving in the light. I moved out the next day, breaking the lease and leaving everything behind. I didn't care about the deposit or the angry calls from the landlord. I just needed to get away. But the ringing never stopped. It followed me wherever I went. At midnight, every night I hear it. Faint, distant, like a call from another world. I've changed numbers, moved cities, but it always finds me. I've come to realize that it's not just the phone. It's something else. Something that's attached itself to me. Something that won't let go. I still hear her voice sometimes when I'm on the edge of sleep. She's trapped, she says. Stuck between worlds, looking for someone to help her find her way out. And no matter how far I run, I can't escape the feeling that it's not her that's trapped, it's me. They say the mind plays tricks on you when you're alone in the dark. I used to think that was true, just the brain's way of coping with isolation. But after what happened to me, I'm not so sure anymore. It started when I moved into my new apartment, a small, cheap unit on the 4th floor of a crumbling old building. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and I was eager to start fresh after a rough breakup. The neighbors were quiet, and the rent was surprisingly low, so I didn't ask too many questions. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking and trying to make the place feel like home. It was late on the 3rd night when I first noticed it. A faint tapping sound, like knuckles gently rapping on wood. I brushed it off as the building settling or maybe pipes clanging. Nothing unusual in a place this old. But the sound kept coming back. Every night, around the same time, just as I was about to drift off to sleep. It was subtle at first, just a soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from the walls. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe some kind of animal stuck in the walls. But deep down, it felt deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I tried to ignore it, but it only got worse. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Sometimes it was right behind my headboard. Other times it echoed from the hallway. I'd lie there in the dark, heart pounding, straining to listen. I even tried knocking back a few times, hoping that whatever or whoever was making the noise would stop. But it never did. If anything, it got bolder. One night, after hours of sleeplessness, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and checked every corner of my apartment. I banged on the walls, tapped the pipes, and even climbed up to check the crawl space above the ceiling. But there was nothing, no sign of rodents, no hidden pipes, no explanation at all. Just the relentless tapping, now seemingly mocking my efforts. I mentioned it to my landlord the next day, a grizzled old man with a permanent scowl. He shrugged it off, muttering something about old buildings making noise. He didn't seem interested, and I didn't push it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it, that he knew something he wasn't telling me. Then came the whispers. It was a few nights later, around 3 a.m. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible murmur, like someone speaking in the next room. I sat up, holding my breath, trying to make out the words, but they were too garbled, too soft. The tapping continued, but now it was joined by this eerie, unintelligible whispering. I bolted out of bed, adrenaline surging. I pressed my ear against the wall, hoping to catch something, anything that made sense. The whispers seemed to ebb and flow, like a conversation just beyond reach. They were low, hissing, filled with a strange urgency that made my skin crawl. I spent hours pacing my apartment, checking every possible source of the noise. I even went out into the hallway, knocking on my neighbors' doors, but no one answered. The place felt deserted, like I was the only one left in a building filled with empty shells. I could feel the walls closing in, the air growing thicker, the whispers following me wherever I went. The next day I decided to dig deeper. I scoured the internet for any information about the building, looking for any hint of past incidents, anything that could explain what I was experiencing. That's when I found it, an old news article from decades ago, buried in the depths of an obscure forum. The building had once been a small mental institution back in the early 1900s. It was shut down after a series of patient disappearances that were never explained. The article mentioned something about unusual architecture and hidden spaces, but offered no further details. I stared at the grainy black and white photo of the building, my building, and felt a chill run down my spine. That night, the tapping and whispering returned with a vengeance. They were louder, closer, as if they were coming from inside my apartment. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a hammer from my toolbox and started tearing at the wall where the noise was the loudest. Plaster crumbled, dust filled the air, and I hacked away until my arms ached and my lungs burned. Then I hit something solid, something that didn't belong. I pried at the boards, pulling them away, revealing a hidden space, a small narrow crawl space that ran behind the walls. The smell hit me first, a rank, musty odor that made my stomach churn. I shone my flashlight inside and saw them, old faded photographs pinned to the wooden beams, dozens of them, all showing the same thing. People standing in the very room I was in, their faces blank and lifeless. Some were wearing hospital gowns, others in ordinary clothes, but they all had the same vacant expression, eyes staring straight ahead. But the worst part? In the center of the crawl space, nestled among the debris, was a small, dusty tape recorder. I reached in, my hand shaking, and pressed play. The whispers filled the room, clear and deafening. They were the same voices I'd been hearing for nights on end, looping over and over in a maddening, endless cycle. And then, through the static and the murmurs, I heard something new. A single distinct voice cutting through the chaos. "Let us out!" I dropped the recorder, stumbling back. The walls seemed to pulse, vibrating with the sound, the whispers now frantic, desperate. I ran from the apartment, slamming the door behind me, the noise following me down the hallway like an echo that wouldn't fade. I never went back. I packed my things and moved out the next day, leaving behind the deposit, the furniture, everything. The landlord didn't seem surprised when I handed over the keys. He just nodded, a knowing look in his eyes, and muttered something about the building needing special maintenance. I still hear the tapping sometimes, in the dead of night when everything is quiet. I tell myself it's just in my head, a lingering echo of a nightmare I've left behind. But every now and then, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can still hear those whispers, faint and persistent, like a reminder that some places never really let you go. I've always loved the quiet of nighttime drives. There's something peaceful about being on an empty road, just the hum of the engine and the darkness stretching out in front of you. That night, I was coming back from visiting an old friend in a neighboring town, a trip I'd done countless times before. But this time was different. This time I took a wrong turn. The GPS had been glitching for the last few miles, rerouting me in circles through back roads I'd never seen. It was well past midnight, and the moon hung low, casting long shadows that twisted like fingers across the asphalt. I figured it was just a minor detour, nothing I couldn't fix with a little bit of luck. But after 10 minutes, I found myself on a narrow, tree-lined road that didn't show up on any map. My headlights barely pierced the suffocating darkness around me. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches stretching overhead like skeletal arms. The air felt heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was irrational, of course, just the effect of being alone in the middle of nowhere. But then I saw it, a figure standing by the side of the road, just ahead. At first, I thought it was a hitchhiker, someone lost or stranded. As I got closer, the figure came into focus. It was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned black suit, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't move, didn't react to my approaching car. He just stood there, facing the road, watching. I slowed down, hesitating. Something about him felt off. His posture, too stiff. His skin, too pale. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel his gaze, cold and unblinking, drilling into me through the windshield. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly sped up, putting distance between us. But as I rounded the next bend, there he was again. The same man, standing just as still, just as silent, watching me pass by. My pulse quickened. It was impossible. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. I pressed down on the gas, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe it was a different person, or maybe I was just tired. The road twisted and turned, and each time I thought I'd escaped, I'd see him again. Always ahead, always watching. His presence was relentless, like a dark shadow I couldn't outrun. My car's clock seemed stuck, the minutes dragging into eternity. No matter how fast I drove, the man was always there, waiting at every turn. I started to panic, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. I fumbled with my phone, desperate to get a signal, but the screen was blank. No bars, no GPS, just a dead rectangle in my trembling hands. The car's radio crackled with static, the faintest hint of a voice whispering beneath the noise. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a warning, a low, urgent murmur that sent chills through my bones. Suddenly, the road opened up into a clearing, and I spotted a gas station. Its old, flickering neon sign a welcome sight in the sea of darkness. Relief washed over me. I pulled in, the tires screeching against the gravel, and practically jumped out of the car. The place was deserted, run down, but the lights were on, and that was enough for me. I rushed inside, the bell above the door jangling loudly. The clerk, an elderly man with a wrinkled face and sunken eyes, looked up from his newspaper. His expression didn't change as I babbled about the man on the road. He just stared at me, as if he'd heard it all before. "Seen him too, huh?" he finally said, his voice low and tired. "You're not the first." I didn't understand. The clerk went on to explain that the road I'd taken didn't exist on any maps because it wasn't supposed to be there. Not anymore. It was part of a forgotten route, shut down years ago after a series of accidents. Drivers claimed they'd seen a man in a black suit appearing out of nowhere, causing them to swerve off the road. Some said he was the spirit of a traveler who died in one of those crashes, cursed to wander the road forever. Others believed he was something far older, something that preyed on lost souls. I didn't want to hear any of it. I just wanted to get out of there. The clerk offered to show me the way back to the main highway, and I gladly accepted. As I followed his directions, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man in the suit standing on the roadside, watching me disappear into the night. But the road remained empty, and I finally made it back to familiar streets. The neon lights of the city were a welcome sight, and I pulled into my driveway, exhausted but grateful to be home. I tried to shake off the night's events as just a bad dream, a trick of exhaustion and stress. But as I got out of the car, I froze. There, on my doorstep, was a small black object. I picked it up, my hands trembling. It was a wide-brimmed hat, old and worn, but unmistakably the same as the one the man on the road had been wearing. I dropped it, stumbling back. The shadows around me seemed to stretch and twist, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw him, just a flicker of darkness at the edge of my vision. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just the silent street, empty and still. I don't drive at night anymore. I don't take back roads, and I definitely don't stray from the main routes. But every now and then, when I'm alone and the lights are low, I swear I can feel him, just out of sight, watching, waiting. And I know deep down that no matter where I go, the man in the suit will always find me. Because once you've seen him, you're never truly alone again. I never considered myself easily spooked. I mean, I'm a rational guy. I've always been the one to dismiss ghost stories and creepy folklore as nothing more than people's overactive imaginations. But that night, my belief shattered in ways I still struggle to piece together. It started with a dare. My friends and I were driving through a small town, the kind of place that practically screams dead end from every boarded-up window. We'd heard about this abandoned hotel on the outskirts, a grand old building with a tragic history. Of course, every town has its haunted place, but this one came with a twist. No one ever made it past room 414. Naturally, we decided to test the legend. The hotel loomed in the dark, its silhouette jagged against the moonlit sky. Broken windows, crumbling facade, and a heavy sense of decay surrounded it. Inside, the air was stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. Each step we took was met with the crunch of broken glass and the distant groans of the old structure settling into its rot. I led the group, flashlight in hand. The plan was simple. Find room 414, step inside, and then leave with bragging rights. Easy, right? The first few floors were uneventful, just dusty old rooms filled with remnants of a bygone era. It was almost too mundane, and my nerves started to settle. But then, as we climbed the last flight of stairs, the temperature dropped sharply. I could see my breath misting in front of me, hanging in the air like a bad omen. That's when I noticed the number, 414, faint but unmistakable on the peeling door. We stood there hesitating, waiting for someone else to take the lead. That's when the door creaked open on its own. Just a crack, but enough to make my heart pound in my chest. The others urged me forward, and I, not wanting to show fear, stepped in first. The room was empty. No ghosts, no bloodstains, just four walls, a decrepit bed, and a window that rattled against the wind. It seemed ordinary. I laughed, shaking off the tension. I was about to call the others in when I noticed something strange. The door, which I'd left ajar, was now closed. And the handle was missing. I turned back to the room, trying to keep my cool, but everything had changed. The walls were no longer cracked and faded. They were pristine, covered in vibrant floral wallpaper. The bed was neatly made, and the air was thick with the scent of roses. It felt like I'd stepped back in time. I backed up, reaching for my phone, but the screen stayed dark. No signal, no battery, just a dead black mirror reflecting my growing panic. I slammed my fists against the door, shouting for my friends, but the sound barely echoed in the oppressive silence. That's when I heard it, a soft hum, like an old tune played on a gramophone, scratchy and distant. It was coming from the bathroom. The door was slightly open, and from where I stood, I could see a light flickering inside. The hum grew louder, more insistent, as if beckoning me to enter. I knew I shouldn't, but my feet moved on their own. The bathroom was empty, save for a large antique mirror hanging above a clawfoot tub. The hum stopped the moment I stepped in, replaced by a soft whisper like someone speaking right next to my ear. I stared at the mirror. For a moment I saw my reflection, wide-eyed and terrified. But then, it shifted. My reflection stayed still as I moved. Its expression twisted into a grin that wasn't mine. I stumbled back, but the mirror me didn't budge. It leaned closer, the grin stretching impossibly wide, and whispered in a voice that sent chills down my spine. "It's your turn now." The lights flickered, and in a blink, everything went dark. I fumbled for the door, but I wasn't in the bathroom anymore. I was back in room 414, but this time, I wasn't alone. Figures stood around me, faces blurred and indistinct, all humming that same haunting tune. Their eyes were hollow, staring through me as if I wasn't even there. I screamed for my friends, for anyone, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. The figures began to move, slow and deliberate, circling around me like vultures. I backed into the corner, my heart racing until I felt the wall behind me give way. I fell through, tumbling into darkness. I hit the ground hard, knocking the wind out of me. When I looked up, I was outside the hotel, sprawled on the overgrown grass. The night was quiet, too quiet, and the hotel stood as it had before, cold and unyielding. My friends found me there shaking and incoherent. They never saw what I did. To them, I'd just vanished for a few minutes. But for me, it felt like hours. I never told them what happened inside room 414. They wouldn't believe me anyway. But the worst part? The twist that still haunts me to this day. Every mirror I look into now shows me that same twisted grin. It's not my face, but it's always watching, waiting. And somehow I know that one day it'll be my turn again. I've always been a book lover. There's something about getting lost in a story that feels like magic, an escape from reality that I crave more than anything else. So when I found out that the old library in my town was reopening after decades of being closed, I was thrilled. The building was ancient, one of those grand Gothic structures with towering spires and gargoyle statues peering down from the roof. It had been abandoned for years, boarded up and forgotten, and no one seemed to know why it had closed in the first place. On opening day, I was one of the first in line. As soon as the doors creaked open, I stepped inside, inhaling the familiar scent of old books and musty paper. The library was just as I imagined. Rows of towering shelves filled with leather-bound volumes, dark wood paneling, and stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns on the dusty floor. It was beautiful, in a haunting sort of way. I spent hours exploring, wandering through the aisles, running my fingers along the spines of books that hadn't been touched in decades. There were classics, obscure titles, and a few that looked like they hadn't been checked out since the library first opened. I was in heaven. That's when I found the staircase. It was tucked away in the back corner of the library, partially hidden behind a row of shelves. A narrow spiral staircase that descended into darkness. I hesitated, looking around to see if anyone else had noticed it, but the other patrons were busy browsing, oblivious. There were no signs indicating what was down there. No ropes or barriers to keep people out. Just a dim light bulb overhead, flickering weakly. Curiosity got the better of me, as it always does. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, then cautiously made my way down the steps. The air grew colder with each step, and the sound of my footsteps echoed off the stone walls. It felt like I was descending into another world, far removed from the cozy warmth of the library above. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a long, narrow hallway lined with heavy oak doors, each one labeled with a brass number. They looked old, ancient even, and the paint was peeling off the walls in long strips. The air was damp and carried a faint metallic smell that made my skin crawl. I walked slowly, peering into each door as I passed. Most of them were locked, but through the small, dusty windows, I could see shelves filled with books and artifacts, things that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a library. The place had an eerie, forgotten feel, like it hadn't been touched in years. At the end of the hallway, one door was slightly ajar. The brass number on it read 13, and a faint light flickered from within. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly, and stepped inside. The room was small and cramped, with shelves packed tightly together, towering almost to the ceiling. Unlike the rest of the library, these books were in pristine condition, their covers unmarked, their pages crisp and white. They seemed out of place. Too new, too perfect. I picked one up, flipping through the pages. The text was written in a language I didn't recognize, symbols and runes that looked ancient, almost alien. As I skimmed through it, I noticed something odd. The symbols seemed to move, shifting on the page like they were alive, writhing and twisting into new shapes. It made my eyes hurt to look at them for too long, like they were burrowing into my mind. I set the book down, my hands trembling. I was about to leave when I noticed something strange. One of the shelves had a gap, a small space where a book was missing. On the wall behind it was a faint hand-drawn symbol, matching the ones in the book I had just been reading. It looked like some kind of star, with jagged lines and sharp angles. Underneath, written in tiny spidery letters, was a date, 1922. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I knew the library had been closed for years, but 1922 was nearly a century ago. Why would something so old be hidden down here, in a place no one was supposed to find? As I stared at the symbol, the lights in the room flicker red, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a shadow move across the wall, a tall, thin figure, just on the edge of my vision. I spun around, but the room was empty. Just shelves and books, all still and silent. I grabbed my phone, intending to take a picture of the symbol, but as I lifted the screen, my flashlight flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, and I felt a rush of panic. I fumbled with the phone, trying to get the light back on, but it was dead, completely unresponsive. The only light came from the dim bulb in the hallway, casting a faint glow through the open door. I turned to leave, but the door was no longer ajar. It was closed, and when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. I pushed harder, slamming my shoulder against the wood, but it was like the door was glued shut. Then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound like something moving between the shelves. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, squinting into the darkness. The sound grew closer, the shuffling becoming a faint scraping like nails dragging along stone. I reached out, my hand brushing against the spines of the books, searching for anything I could use to defend myself. But they were cold, almost wet to the touch, and when I pulled my hand back, my fingers were stained with a dark, oily substance. The scraping stopped, replaced by a low whisper, a voice that seemed to echo from all directions at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, desperate, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like I was hearing the final frantic prayers of someone who knew they were about to die. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but the only response was the whispering, growing louder, more insistent. I turned, pressing my back against the door, and that's when I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, emerging from between the shelves. They were tall and gaunt, their bodies twisted and elongated, their faces hidden in shadows. Their eyes glowed faintly, like embers, and their mouths hung open, emitting that terrible, incessant whisper. I closed my eyes, praying it was a hallucination, that I was imagining it. But the whispering grew louder, filling my ears, my head, drowning out my thoughts. I felt something cold and sharp brush against my arm, and when I opened my eyes, they were right in front of me, so close I could see the hollow pits where their eyes should have been. I don't remember how I got out. One minute I was in that room, the next I was running up the stairs, bursting into the main library, gasping for breath. The librarian looked up from her desk, startled, but I didn't stop to explain. I ran out of the building, not slowing down until I was back home, safe behind a locked door. I haven't gone back since. I tried to tell myself it was a nightmare, a trick of the mind brought on by too many horror novels and old ghost stories. But I know what I saw. I know those books. Those things were real. I've spent hours online searching for any information about the library, about what happened in 1922. But there's nothing. Just a blank spot in history, like someone had gone out of their way to erase it. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that whispering again, faint but unmistakable. I've thrown out the clothes I wore that day, changed my phone, even moved to a new apartment, but it doesn't matter. The whispering follows me, growing louder every night, like it's getting closer, like it's trying to tell me something. And I can't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, I should have left that basement door closed. Because whatever I let out that day, it's not done with me yet. I've always been a bit of a night owl, and working the graveyard shift as a security guard at an old apartment complex suited me just fine. The pay wasn't great, but the job was easy. I'd make my rounds every hour, check the cameras, and most nights I'd kill time by reading or watching videos on my phone. It was peaceful, almost too quiet sometimes, but I didn't mind. Until the night I met the tenant in 12B. The building I worked at was one of those relics from the 70s, with dingy wallpaper, flickering lights, and an elevator that groaned like it might give up at any moment. Most of the tenants were older folks who'd lived there for decades, and the place had a reputation for being a little off. People said it was haunted, but I never paid much attention to that kind of talk. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, at least not then. One night I was doing my rounds and I noticed something strange on the security monitors. The camera in the East Wing hallway right outside apartment 12B was glitching. The feed kept cutting in and out, flickering with static. I figured it was just an old camera acting up, so I made a mental note to report it and went about my business. But as the night went on, the glitches got worse. Every time I checked, the static seemed more intense, almost like it was deliberate, like something was trying to interfere with the signal. At around 3 a.m., I decided to go check it out in person. I took the stairs up to the 12th floor, not trusting the elevator at that hour. As I stepped into the hallway, I was hit by a sudden chill. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. The lights overhead flickered, casting erratic shadows along the walls. As I approached apartment 12B, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. It was odd because I knew for a fact that the place was supposed to be vacant. The previous tenant, an old man named Mr. Hewitt, had passed away months ago, and the apartment hadn't been rented out since. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to call it in, but my curiosity got the better of me. I nudged the door open with my flashlight, calling out, "Hello? Security? Anyone here?" No response, just a heavy silence. I stepped inside, sweeping the room with my flashlight. The apartment was empty, just like I'd expected. No furniture, no personal items, just bare walls and a thick layer of dust coating the floor. But something felt wrong. The air was colder inside, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow, darting across the far wall. I swung my flashlight around, but there was nothing there, just empty space. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, maybe a trick of the light. I was about to step back into the hallway when I heard it. A soft, barely audible whisper. "Help me." The voice was thin, weak, like it was struggling to be heard. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It sounded like it was coming from the other side of the apartment, near the bedroom. I called out again, but no answer. Just that faint, pleading whisper repeating the same words. Help me. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, moving slowly, every step heavy with dread. The bedroom door was closed, and the whispering seemed to be coming from behind it. I reached for the handle, hesitating just for a second before pushing it open. The room was empty, completely empty except for a single old-fashioned rotary phone sitting on the floor in the center of the room. It was out of place, the kind of phone you'd see in movies from the 60s, with a thick, coiled cord and a faded beige color. The receiver was off the hook, resting beside it, and the soft, persistent whisper echoed from the speaker. I crouched down, my hand hovering over the receiver. The whisper was louder now, but still garbled, like a bad connection. I picked it up, pressing it to my ear. The voice was clear for a split second, just long enough for me to hear the words, "He's coming," before the line went dead with a sharp click. I stood up, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get out of that apartment, but I couldn't move. I felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of dread. And then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway. They were heavy, each step sending a low vibration through the floor. I backed away from the bedroom door, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The footsteps stopped just outside the room, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then the door creaked open, just a crack, and I saw him. A figure, tall and thin, standing in the hallway. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could see the outline of his body, unnaturally still, like a mannequin. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment it illuminated his face. I wish it hadn't. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, eyes sunken and hollow, with a mouth twisted into a grotesque smile that seemed too wide, too sharp. He took a step forward, his head cocking to one side as if he were studying me, amused by my fear. I stumbled back, tripping over the phone, and fell to the floor. The figure moved closer, his footsteps echoing in the silent room. I scrambled to my feet and bolted, tearing down the hallway without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the lobby, gasping for breath, my mind racing. I called the police, trying to explain what I had seen, but my words came out in a jumbled mess. They arrived a short time later, checking the building and apartment 12B, but of course there was nothing. No figure, no whispering phone, nothing to prove what I'd experienced. The apartment was still empty, and the officers gave me that look, the one that says they think you're crazy but are too polite to say it. They told me to get some rest, maybe take a night off, and that they'd keep an eye on the place just in case. I took their advice and went home, but I couldn't shake the image of that figure, that face. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think of anything else. The next night I showed up for my shift, determined to prove I wasn't losing my mind. I watched the cameras closely, especially the one outside 12B, but everything seemed normal. No glitches, no shadows, just an empty hallway. It was almost 3 a.m. when I heard it again, the faint sound of a rotary phone ringing, echoing from somewhere in the building. I stared at the monitor, and there, clear as day, was the figure, standing outside 12B, staring directly into the camera. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his mouth twisted into that same horrific smile. And then he moved, slowly turning and walking down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows. The phone continued to ring, louder now, as if demanding my attention. I ripped off my headset and bolted out of the security room, but no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the sound. It was everywhere, echoing through the halls, relentless and inescapable. I quit the next day, left the job in the city altogether. I didn't care about the money or the embarrassment. I just needed to get away from that place, away from whatever was in apartment 12B. I moved across the country, took a job at a quiet little office, and tried to forget about it. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. The faint ringing of an old rotary phone echoing in the distance. And I know that somewhere, somehow he's still watching, still waiting. And I can't help but feel that one day, when I least expect it, he'll find me again. Because some doors once opened can never truly be shut. I've always been a fan of solo hikes. There's something about the quiet of the forest, the solitude, the feeling of being completely alone that clears my mind like nothing else. I'd go out almost every weekend, no matter the weather, just me and the trees, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional rustle of an animal in the underbrush. It was my escape from the noise of the city, the stress of work, and the grind of everyday life. There's one trail, in particular, I'd always wanted to try. It's not marked on any map, just an overgrown path I spotted one day while hiking in the national park near my town. I'd asked around about it, but no one seemed to know where it led. Most people hadn't even noticed it before, and those who had just shrugged it off. Probably just an old hunting trail, they said, not worth exploring. But I was curious. It called to me in a way I couldn't quite explain, like it was waiting for someone to rediscover it. So one overcast Saturday, I decided to follow it. I packed my usual gear, a flashlight, some water, a snack, and my trusty pocket knife, and set off early in the morning. The entrance to the trail was almost hidden by dense foliage, a narrow gap between the trees that you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. I pushed through the thicket, branches snagging at my clothes, and soon found myself on a barely visible path winding deeper into the woods. It was darker here, the trees packed tightly together, their branches reaching overhead to form a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The air was heavy, damp, and carried a faint, earthy smell like moss and wet leaves. For the first hour, it was just a typical hike. The path was rough but manageable, and I was enjoying the sense of adventure. But then I started to notice things, small things that felt out of place. The trees here were different, twisted and gnarled, with bark that looked almost burnt. There were no sounds of birds or animals, just an eerie silence that pressed in from all sides. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, the unfamiliarity of the trail playing tricks on me. But then I saw the footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the dirt, but unmistakable. Human footprints, heading in the same direction I was going. They looked fresh, too, like they had been made that morning. A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, and I hadn't heard anything, not a single sound to indicate someone else was nearby. I should have turned back then. I should have taken those footprints as a warning. But instead, I kept going, my curiosity getting the better of me. I rationalized it. Maybe it was just an old hiker who'd set off earlier than me, or maybe a hunter exploring the area. Nothing to worry about. The further I went, the stranger things became. I started to see odd carvings on the trees, symbols I didn't recognize, etched deep into the bark. They looked old, the edges worn and weathered, like they'd been there for decades. And then there were the noises, soft whispers carried on the wind, just on the edge of hearing. Impossible to make out, but always there, like a low, constant hum. It was getting late, and the trail showed no signs of ending. The sky had darkened, heavy clouds blotting out the sun, and I realized I hadn't seen a single animal since I started. No squirrels, no birds, nothing. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting. I stopped to take a break, sitting on a fallen log and sipping some water, when I felt it, eyes on me. I glanced around, my heart thumping in my chest, but there was no one there, just trees and shadows. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I could sense someone watching, lurking just beyond my sight. And then I saw him, a figure standing among the trees, half hidden in the shadows. He was tall, unnaturally so, with long limbs and a gaunt face that seemed too pale, too empty. He wore a ragged coat, frayed at the edges, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in darkness. For a moment I thought maybe it was just a trick of the light, a branch or a shadow playing tricks on my eyes. But then he moved. It was a slow, deliberate step, almost like he was gliding, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them, boring into me, cold and unblinking. My first instinct was to call out, to ask if he needed help, but something stopped me. A primal, instinctive fear that told me to stay quiet, to stay still. I turned slowly, trying not to make a sound, and started back down the trail. My footsteps were fast, hurried, but I forced myself not to run. I didn't want to draw attention, didn't want to provoke, whatever it was. I kept my eyes forward, but I could still feel him behind me, matching my pace, just far enough back that I couldn't see him if I glanced over my shoulder. The trail seemed longer on the way back, twisting and turning in ways I didn't remember. My breathing was ragged, panic clawing at my chest, but I kept moving, kept putting one foot in front of the other. The whispers were louder now, almost like they were inside my head, mingling with the sound of my own heartbeat. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw it, the opening in the trees that led back to the main trail. Relief washed over me, and I broke into a sprint, bursting through the undergrowth and back onto the familiar path. I stopped, panting, and turned to look back. The hidden trail was gone. The gap in the trees where I had entered was just forest, thick and impenetrable. I stood there, heart racing, trying to make sense of it, but there was nothing. No sign of the path, no sign of the man, just the quiet woods and the distant sound of birdsong. I practically ran back to my car, not stopping until I was behind the wheel, doors locked, engine running. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was back home, safe inside my apartment with the doors locked and the lights on. I spent the rest of the night trying to convince myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by fatigue and the isolation of the woods. But the next morning I found something that made my blood run cold. I pulled my hiking boots out of the closet, intending to clean them off, and that's when I saw it. Tucked inside one of the boots was a small folded piece of paper. My hands shook as I unfolded it. It was a photograph, black and white, faded with age. It showed a man standing in the woods, tall and thin, with a ragged coat and a wide-brimmed hat, staring directly at the camera. But it wasn't the man that caught my attention. It was the background. Because behind him, partially hidden among the trees, was a small, indistinct figure. It was me. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. There was no way it could have been taken yesterday. It looked decades old. But there I was, clear as day, staring out from the photo, my face twisted in fear. I turned the photo over, my breath catching as I saw the faint writing on the back. "Welcome back," it read in thin, spidery handwriting. "I haven't gone hiking since. The boots are still sitting by the door, the photo hidden in a drawer, but every time I try to throw them away, something stops me, a nagging feeling, a whisper in the back of my mind telling me that it's not over, that he's still out there watching, waiting. And sometimes in the quiet of the night I hear it again, that faint, familiar whisper calling me back to the woods." The old factory loomed before me, its crumbling brick walls and broken windows casting an ominous shadow in the moonlight. As the new night security guard, I had been tasked with patrolling this abandoned industrial site, a job that filled me with a growing sense of dread. With a heavy sigh, I gripped my flashlight tightly and stepped through the rusted gates, my footsteps echoing eerily in the deafening silence. The air was thick with the musty scent of decay, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I made my way through the winding corridors, my senses were on high alert. The shadows seemed to move and shift, and every creak and groan of the aging building set my nerves on edge. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the factory. I whirled around, my heart pounding, and shone my light down the darkened hallway. At first, I saw nothing, but then a movement caught my eye. Slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows, shambling towards me with a jerky, unnatural gait. As it drew closer, I recoiled in horror. It was a man, but his features were twisted and distorted. his skin a sickly, pallid hue. His eyes were sunken and lifeless, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. I fumbled for my radio, my fingers trembling. "This is security. We've got a situation here. I need backup. Immediately." But there was only static in response. I was alone. The creature let out a guttural moan and lunged towards me, its bony hands outstretched. I stumbled backwards, swinging my flashlight wildly, but it was no use. The thing was too fast, too strong. It grabbed me by the throat, its grip like iron. I gasped for air, my vision blurring, as it leaned in close, its fetid breath washing over me. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, its voice a horrifying mixture of human and something else, something inhuman. Just as I thought all was lost, a loud crash echoed from behind the creature. It whirled around, its grip loosening, and I saw a figure emerge from the shadows. A woman, tall and lithe, her movements graceful and predatory. She moved with lightning speed, her fists landing blows on the creature with such force that it staggered backwards, howling in pain. I watched, transfixed, as the two engaged in a brutal, almost inhuman battle, their shadows dancing across the walls. Finally, the creature let out an agonizing scream and crumpled to the ground, unmoving. The woman stood over it, her chest heaving, a triumphant glint in her eyes. She turned to me and I froze, certain that I was next. But instead she spoke, her voice low and urgent. "You need to get out of here now. This place is not safe." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears, the woman's footsteps close behind me. I burst out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. I turned to look back, but the woman had vanished, leaving only the eerie silence of the deserted street. As I made my way home, my mind raced with questions. What was that creature? Who was the woman? And how had she defeated it so easily? And what the hell had I just witnessed? One thing was certain, I would never set foot in that factory again. It was a frigid November night when I took on my new gig as a security guard at the old Whitmore factory. The place had been shut down for years, with its crumbling brick walls and shattered windows telling a tale of decay and neglect. The company had just acquired it for a redevelopment project, and my job was to patrol the property until construction began. Simple enough, right? My first night started off uneventful. I made my rounds, checking every corner of the decrepit building. The wind howled through the empty spaces and shadows danced on the walls. The factory was like a massive mausoleum, and I could almost hear the ghosts of its past laborers whispering through the drafty corridors. Around midnight, I was in the back storage area, where the dust was so thick it felt like stepping into a cloud. As I walked, my flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing old machinery and forgotten tools. That's when I saw something that didn't belong, a glint of metal sticking out from beneath a pile of debris. I moved closer and uncovered what looked like a large rusty key. It was peculiar, but I shrugged it off and continued my patrol. However, the key was in the back of my mind, itching at me. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't quite place it. The next couple of hours were routine, but then my radio crackled with static before going silent. I tried to re-establish communication, but nothing worked. I was alone, truly alone. It wasn't unusual for technology to fail in such an old place, but it added to the unsettling atmosphere. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping sound coming from somewhere deep inside the building. It was faint at first, like a heartbeat echoing through the halls. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing off the cold concrete. I found myself in the factory's basement. The thumping grew louder and more insistent, like something trying to break free. I shone my flashlight around, but all I saw were old pipes and broken storage crates. My heart pounded as I followed the sound to an old reinforced door at the end of a dimly lit corridor. I hesitated. The door was new compared to the rest of the factory. A lock hung from it, rusted and old, but the key I'd found earlier fit perfectly. My hand trembled as I unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open. Inside, the room was a stark contrast to the rest of the factory, pristine, almost clinical, with bright white walls and a single metal table in the center. On the table were several old photographs, each showing a different worker from the factory's heyday. Their faces were worn and tired, but it was the writing on the back of each photograph that sent chills down my spine. The messages were the same. We can't escape. They're coming for us. Just then, I heard a door slam shut behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The air grew colder, and the thumping grew louder, more frantic. I turned back to the photographs and noticed something even more horrifying. One of the photos had a new addition. My face stared back at me from the photograph with the same tired, haunted expression as the others. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I felt a presence in the room closing in on me. Shadows moved on their own, and whispers filled the air, unintelligible but full of dread. I tried to open the door, but it was locked from the outside. I was trapped. As panic set in, I noticed a door on the far side of the room, partially hidden behind a curtain. I hurried over and found it unlocked. The room beyond was a small, dark chamber with a single old-fashioned television flickering with static. I approached it, and the screen began to show a series of images, each one a security camera feed from around the factory. And then I saw it, a figure moving through the building, not on any of the cameras I had used, but one that seemed to be live. It was a man dressed in a similar security uniform, but with a face twisted in agony. His eyes locked with mine through the screen, and his mouth formed a silent scream. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't my first night here. I was seeing the last moments of every guard who had come before me. They were trapped in this nightmare, doomed to relive their final moments. The factory's lights flickered, and I heard the rhythmic thumping again, now unmistakably the sound of footsteps approaching. The whispers grew louder, forming coherent words. "It's your turn. We warned you." I turned and saw the figure from the screen walking towards me, his face still twisted in that haunting scream. He reached out a hand, and the room's temperature plummeted. I stumbled back, falling into the chamber's shadows. The door slammed shut behind me, and the last thing I saw was the factory's white walls closing in as the figure reached for me. So there you have it, folks. That's my story, the night I became a permanent resident of Whitmore Factory. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, remember to check the history of the place you're guarding, and whatever you do, don't go looking for things you're better off leaving alone. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious. And remember, some keys are best left forgotten. It was the dead of winter, and the Kavanaugh building stood like a rotting sentinel in the heart of downtown. The towering structure had been abandoned for over a decade, a relic of an age gone by. I was new to the security gig, and the night shifts at the Kavanaugh were the only ones left. The old-timers had warned me about the place, but I'd brushed it off as superstitious nonsense. I wish I hadn't. My shift started at 11 p.m., and as the clock ticked past midnight, the building seemed to breathe and groan with its own ancient life. My station was the security office on the ground floor, a cramped room with a single flickering monitor connected to a handful of dusty cameras scattered throughout the building. At first, the night was uneventful. I scanned the feeds periodically, mostly focusing on the empty hallways and deserted offices. But around 2 a.m., things started to get strange. The cameras began to glitch, flickering in and out of static. I figured it was just an issue with the old equipment. Then something caught my eye. A shadow moved across one of the screens. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, but the shadow was gone. I rewound the footage, and there it was again, a dark, fleeting form darting down a hallway. Curiosity piqued, I decided to investigate. The building's hallways were unnervingly silent, save for the creaking of the old floors beneath my feet. I approached the hallway where I'd seen the shadow, the dim light from my flashlight barely penetrating the darkness. The camera feed on my phone seemed to be glitching even more, showing static and occasional flashes of distorted images. I searched the hallway, finding nothing out of the ordinary. Feeling a mix of relief and disappointment, I started to head back to the office. That's when I heard it, a faint whispering, like someone talking just out of earshot. I froze, straining to hear. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but still, I couldn't make out any words. I decided to follow the sound, which led me to an old office with a rusted nameplate barely visible, Dr. Andrew Kavanaugh. The door was ajar, and the whispers seemed to be coming from inside. With my heart pounding, I pushed the door open. The office was cluttered with forgotten papers and old furniture, but there was something unsettling about the room. The whispers grew louder, as if they were right behind me. I turned, expecting to see someone or something, but the room was empty. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my flashlight flickering erratically. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The whispers crescendoed into frantic, unintelligible murmurs. I scrambled to get out, but the door wouldn't budge. I pounded on it, shouting for help, but my voice seemed to disappear into the void. The whispers turned into a cacophony of indistinct voices, growing louder and more desperate. In a moment of sheer panic, I grabbed a nearby chair and smashed it against the door. The door burst open, and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. The whispers faded, leaving only the sound of my racing heartbeat. I returned to the security office, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I checked the cameras again, but they were working perfectly now, showing nothing but empty hallways. I reviewed the footage from earlier, but the shadow I'd seen was gone. Instead, the footage was clean and clear. As dawn approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I packed up my things, eager to leave the building behind. Just before I left, I noticed something odd. A stack of old files in the corner of the security office. They were labeled Kavanaugh Project and seemed to contain documents about the building's history. I skimmed through them quickly and stumbled upon a chilling detail. The Kavanaugh building had been involved in secret experiments in the 1970s. One document mentioned something about ethereal entities and communication with the beyond. My blood ran cold as I realized the whispers I'd heard were likely not from someone in the building, but from something that had been trapped there for decades. As I walked out into the early morning light, the chill of the building still clung to me. I glanced back at the towering structure, now bathed in the soft light of dawn. The shadows of the Kavanaugh building seemed to watch me, as if knowing I had uncovered their secret. And as I drove away, I couldn't help but wonder if I had really escaped, or if the whispers had followed me into the daylight. When I took the job as a night security guard at Ravenwood Asylum, I knew I was stepping into a place steeped in eerie history. The asylum had been abandoned for decades after a series of scandals and mysterious patient disappearances. Rumors swirled about the building, tales of ghostly apparitions and the cries of those who had suffered within its walls. I was skeptical but needed the paycheck, so I shrugged off the stories and prepared for my first shift. The moment I stepped inside, an unsettling chill washed over me. The air was thick with dust, and the only sounds were the creaking of the old building and the distant echo of dripping water. I flipped on my flashlight, illuminating the peeling wallpaper and the remnants of old furniture scattered throughout the lobby. My job was to patrol the halls every hour and keep an eye on the security cameras, so I set off to explore. As I walked through the dark corridors, I found myself in the old patient wing. The rooms were empty, and the faded names on the doors were a haunting reminder of the lives once lived there. I paused outside room 213, the door slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine, but curiosity drew me closer. I pushed the door open, revealing a room that had been left untouched for years. Dust-covered bed, a cracked mirror, and an unsettling stillness. Suddenly, I heard a soft whisper behind me. "Help us!" It echoed, sending shivers down my spine. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. My heart raced, and I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as my imagination. I stepped back out into the corridor, but the feeling of being watched lingered. As the night wore on, I made my rounds, checking the security monitors in the control room. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At around 2 a.m., I heard a loud bang from the direction of the old treatment room. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the sound, each step echoing in the silence. When I reached the treatment room, the door was wide open. I hesitated, peering inside. The room was dark, but I could make out the outline of old medical equipment and gurneys covered in dust. The air felt heavy, thick with an unseen presence. I stepped inside, and as I did, the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. I banged on it, shouting for help, but my voice echoed back hollowly. The whispers returned, now louder and more insistent. "Help us! Help us!" In that moment, I felt a cold breeze wash over me and the lights flickered. I turned my flashlight toward the corner of the room and froze. There, surrounded by shadows, stood a figure. A woman in a tattered patient gown, her hair hanging in front of her face. My heart raced as I realized she was staring directly at me. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The woman raised her hand, pointing toward the far wall. "Find the truth," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the whispers that surrounded me. Before I could respond, the lights flickered again and the temperature dropped even further. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the room itself was alive with pain and suffering. I turned back to the door, desperately trying to push it open, but it remained firmly shut. "Find the truth," the woman repeated, her voice echoing in my mind. Driven by a mix of fear and determination, I turned back to the room, searching for anything that might shed light on her message. My flashlight beam swept across the walls, and then I saw it, a faded newspaper clipping pinned to the wall with a rusted nail. I stumbled toward it, my heart racing. The article detailed a scandal involving the asylum, a cover-up of patient abuse and unethical experiments conducted by the staff. The last paragraph mentioned a fire that had broken out during a particularly brutal treatment session, resulting in several patients being trapped inside. My stomach churned as I realized the truth. The spirits of those who had suffered here were trapped, unable to find peace. Just then, the door flew open and I stumbled back, nearly falling into the hallway. I turned to see the woman still standing in the treatment room, her expression shifting from anguish to gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered before fading into the shadows. I dashed down the hallway, heart pounding, desperate to escape the asylum. The whispers followed me, but this time they felt different, less desperate, more hopeful. I burst through the front doors and into the cool night air, gasping for breath. As I stood outside, I glanced back at the asylum, its dark silhouette looming against the moonlight. I knew I had uncovered the truth, but I also knew the spirits would remain trapped until someone else helped them find peace. I had done what I could, but I would never return to Ravenwood Asylum. In the days that followed, I quit my job, unable to shake the feeling of those lost souls haunting me. I often wondered about the woman in the gown and the others who had suffered within those walls. Some places hold memories that refuse to fade, and some truths are buried deep, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. My name is Daniel Pierce, and for the past 2 years I've worked as a night security guard at the abandoned Blackwood Asylum, a sprawling Gothic structure that looms over the outskirts of town. The asylum has a notorious reputation, known for its dark history of experiments on patients and unexplained disappearances. I thought I could handle the job, but I was wrong. It was a chilly November night when I took my usual rounds, the wind howling outside like a lost soul. The overhead lights flickered as I made my way through the desolate hallways, the air thick with the scent of mold and decay. My footsteps echoed, a reminder of my solitude in this forsaken place. As I passed the old patient rooms, I glanced inside, half expecting to see ghostly figures lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just rusted beds and peeling wallpaper. I moved on, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Then I reached the day room, where the large cracked mirrors lined the walls. I had always found them unsettling, but tonight they seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. I stood in front of one, the reflection staring back at me, but something felt off. The reflection didn't quite match my movements. I leaned closer, squinting at the glass. Suddenly the reflection smirked at me, a wicked, unnatural grin that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled back, heart racing. "What the hell?" I muttered to myself. My rational mind fought to explain it away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I decided to leave the day room, but as I turned to walk away, the reflection in the mirror shifted again. This time it wasn't just mimicking me. It stepped forward, its eyes dark and hollow, and whispered, "Stay with us." Panic surged through me as I bolted down the hallway, adrenaline propelling me forward. I reached the main entrance, but as I pushed open the heavy doors, they slammed shut in my face, trapping me inside. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but the asylum remained ominously silent. With nowhere else to go, I ran back into the bowels of the building, desperately searching for another exit. I passed through the ward where the most troubled patients had been housed, their screams echoing in my mind. I felt an overwhelming presence behind me, as if I were being hunted. I turned a corner and stumbled into the old recreation room, the windows boarded up and the air thick with dust. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, a relic from when the asylum was operational. It seemed to beckon me closer, its surface shimmering unnaturally. Against my better judgment, I approached the mirror. As I drew nearer, I saw my reflection again, but this time, it was different. The figure in the mirror looked like me, but its expression was twisted in rage. I stepped back, but the reflection reached out, fingers stretching through the glass as if trying to pull me in. "Join us, Daniel," it hissed, the air around me growing colder. "You can't leave." With every ounce of strength, I turned and ran, the sound of my heartbeat drowning out everything else. I barreled down the corridor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Just as I reached the exit, I felt a cold hand grab my shoulder, yanking me backward. I screamed. I found myself back in the day room, the mirrors surrounding me reflecting a cacophony of distorted faces, all pleading, all angry. I was trapped in a nightmare, the asylum's vengeful spirits swirling around me. "Help us," they cried in unison, their voices merging into a deafening roar. The mirrors began to crack, shards flying in every direction. I shielded my face as the glass exploded, the spirits reaching out, their fingers grazing my skin. In a final surge of adrenaline, I dove through the shattered remains of the mirror, the world around me fading into darkness. I felt a rush of cold air engulf me, and then everything went black. When I awoke, I was lying on the ground outside the asylum, the sun rising in the distance. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and glanced back at the building. It loomed ominously, but the mirrors were gone, replaced by solid walls. I stumbled away, my mind racing with confusion. Had it all been a hallucination? Or had I truly encountered the spirits trapped within the asylum's walls? I didn't know, and I didn't care. All I wanted was to get as far away as possible. Weeks passed, and I tried to put the experience behind me. But even now, in the safety of my apartment, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes, when I walk past a mirror, I catch a glimpse of something lurking behind me. Just a fleeting shadow, but enough to send my heart racing. I know I'll never return to Blackwood Asylum. It's a place of darkness, a prison for lost souls. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again, echoing in my mind, reminding me that I can never truly escape. "Join us," they say, their voices a haunting melody that lingers long after the night has ended. My name is Emily Carter, and I work as a security guard at the old Hillcrest Hospital, a decrepit building that has been closed for over a decade. The hospital is infamous in our town for its dark past. Rumors of unethical experiments and ghostly sightings abound. Each night, as I clock in for my shift, I remind myself that it's just a job, a way to pay the bills, but deep down, I know the stories. I began my shift at 10 p.m., armed with my flashlight and a walkie-talkie. The air inside the hospital was musty, the faint smell of mildew clinging to the walls. I made my rounds, passing through the eerily silent corridors lined with empty patient rooms. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead created an unsettling atmosphere, casting long shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. As I reached the pediatrics ward, I heard a soft sound, like a child's giggle, echoing through the empty corridor. My breath caught in my throat. I paused, heart racing, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But the giggle came again, this time followed by the sound of tiny footsteps. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" Silence. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt an overwhelming urge to turn back. But curiosity got the better of me. I advanced cautiously, flashlight beam illuminating the darkened hallway. As I approached the source of the sound, I noticed a flickering light coming from the playroom. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped inside. The room was filled with dusty toys and colorful drawings on the walls, but it was empty. I scanned the area, but all I found was an old teddy bear sitting in the middle of the floor, its button eyes staring blankly at me. Suddenly, the giggling returned, louder this time, echoing around the room. I turned on my flashlight, and the beam landed on a small figure at the far end of the room. A little girl with long dark hair, wearing a faded hospital gown. She was staring at me with wide, innocent eyes. "Are you lost?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The girl smiled but didn't respond. Instead, she turned and began to walk away, glancing back at me as if inviting me to follow. I hesitated, a chill running down my spine, but something compelled me to follow her. Maybe she was a lost child, or perhaps just a figment of my imagination. I trailed her down the corridor, my footsteps echoing in the silence. She led me to the old emergency room, the doors creaking as I pushed them open. Inside, the room was dark, and the only light came from the flickering overhead bulbs. The little girl stood in the center, her back turned to me. "Where are your parents?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She turned slowly, and my heart dropped. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, devoid of any life. "They're coming for me," she whispered, her voice echoing in the empty room. Before I could respond, the overhead lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, panic rising in my chest. When the lights returned, she was gone. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I turned and ran out of the emergency room, back into the hallway, desperate to escape the oppressive darkness. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get out of this haunted place. But as I reached the exit, I heard it again, the soft giggle now mixed with a low, sinister whisper. "Stay with us, Emily." I froze, my blood running cold. How did she know my name? I turned slowly, and there, at the end of the hallway, was the little girl again, her smile wide and unsettling. "Help me," she said, her voice echoing with an unnatural resonance. "Help us." The shadows around her seemed to thicken, and I could feel an overwhelming sense of despair washing over me. I didn't want to be part of this, whatever this was. I turned to run, pushing through the heavy doors and sprinting toward the parking lot. As I reached my car, the world around me felt surreal, as if I had just escaped a waking nightmare. I jumped into the driver's seat and locked the doors, heart pounding. I looked back at the hospital, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but all I saw was darkness. The next day, shaken but determined, I did some research on the hospital. What I found chilled me to the bone. The little girl was real, a patient who had gone missing years ago, presumed dead. The hospital had a history of children disappearing, their spirits said to haunt the building, seeking help or retribution. I never returned to Hillcrest Hospital after that night. Every time I close my eyes, I see her face, her dark eyes pleading for help. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the faint echo of her giggle, a chilling reminder that some spirits never truly leave. Now I tell this story to warn others. Some places are better left undisturbed, their secrets buried in the shadows. Because once you encounter them, you may never be able to escape their grasp. I worked the night shift as a security guard at the old Hargrove Museum of Natural History. The building is a relic from the late 1800s, its walls lined with dusty artifacts and eerie dioramas that seem to watch you as you walk past. I was told the museum was haunted by the spirit of a curator who mysteriously vanished decades ago, but I dismissed it as urban legend until that fateful night. It was a particularly stormy evening in late October, the kind of night that makes your skin crawl. Rain pounded against the windows, lightning flashed, and thunder rumbled like a beast awakening from slumber. My shift started at 10 p.m., and the museum was deserted except for me and the shadows that danced in the flickering overhead lights. I began my rounds, flashlight in hand, as I passed through the dimly lit hallways. The sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere in the depths of the building, a constant reminder that I was very much alone. I made my way to the dinosaur exhibit, where the skeletal remains of a T-Rex loomed over me like a guardian of the past. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. As I continued my patrol, I noticed a strange chill in the air, more than just the draft from the cracked windows. It felt as if the temperature had dropped several degrees, and I could see my breath in front of me. My heart raced, but I brushed it off. It was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The clock struck midnight, and I decided to take a break in the security office, a small room filled with monitors displaying various parts of the museum. I sat down, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my bones. Just as I began to relax, one of the monitors flickered to life, showing the entrance of the museum. Confused, I leaned closer. The camera displayed an empty hallway, until a shadow flickered across the screen. My heart dropped. I quickly switched to the other cameras, but they all showed nothing out of the ordinary. The flicker returned, and I froze as I saw a figure standing in the entrance, shrouded in darkness. "Hello," I called out, my voice wavering. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and burst out of the office, determined to confront whatever it was. The hallway was silent, save for the sound of my footsteps echoing against the cold floor. I reached the entrance but found nothing. Just as I turned to head back, I felt a cold breeze sweep past me. It sent shivers down my spine. I turned the flashlight back on, illuminating the area, but the figure was gone. Had I imagined it? My rational mind wrestled with my fear, but I knew I had seen something. I returned to the security office, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. As I sat there, the monitors flickered again. This time they showed the dinosaur exhibit. My stomach dropped as I watched the T-Rex skeleton sway slightly, as if stirred by an unseen force. I grabbed the radio, but my hands trembled too much to speak. Suddenly the lights flickered, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing through the museum. They were slow and deliberate, echoing like a heartbeat in the silence. I glanced at the monitors and my blood ran cold. The figure was back, now standing directly in front of the dinosaur exhibit, gazing up at the bones with a chilling intensity. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice a mix of anger and fear. But the figure didn't respond. It merely tilted its head, as if studying me. I decided to check it out, my heart pounding in my chest. I approached the exhibit cautiously, the shadows stretching before me like fingers reaching out to pull me in. As I stepped closer, the temperature dropped again, and I could see the figure more clearly. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with a haunting sadness. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing like a distant memory. "Find him." "Who?" I stammered, taken aback. "What do you want?" "Find him, before it's too late," she repeated, her voice fading into a chilling whisper. And just like that, she vanished, leaving me standing in the dim light of the exhibit, heart racing, mind racing. I stumbled back, my mind racing with questions. Who was she, and what did she mean? Suddenly the lights flickered violently, and I heard a loud crash from the back of the museum. I rushed to investigate, adrenaline pumping through my veins. As I reached the source of the sound, I found the ancient Egyptian exhibit in disarray. Statues had toppled over, and the glass display cases lay shattered. But what caught my attention was the mural on the back wall, a depiction of a man being swallowed by darkness. I could have sworn the figure looked eerily familiar. Then it hit me. The curator who had disappeared all those years ago. The woman in the exhibit. I turned to run back to the office when I felt a cold grip on my shoulder. I spun around, flashlight beam illuminating the figure once more. "Find him," she screamed, the shadows swirling around her. In a moment of panic, I stumbled backward and crashed into the security desk, knocking over my radio. That's when I noticed the name on the plaque beside the mural, Henry Hargrove, the very curator who had vanished. His eyes eerily mirrored the woman's. As the realization sank in, the lights went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I could hear whispering all around me, growing louder and more frantic. "Find him, before it's too late." Then the whispers ceased, replaced by an unbearable silence. The lights flickered back on, illuminating the museum in an eerie glow. I looked around, heart racing, but the woman was gone. I was alone. Again. I stumbled back to the security office, my mind racing with the implications. The curator had been searching for something or someone, and now I was trapped in this nightmare. But as I sat there, my breath slowing, I realized something else. I was no longer just a security guard. I was part of the museum's haunting story. I had to uncover the truth behind the mural, the curator's disappearance, and the woman's desperate plea. But as I turned to the monitors, I saw the shadows shift once more, and I knew they were watching me, waiting for me to join them. In that moment, it hit me. The museum wasn't just filled with artifacts. It was filled with souls, and I was becoming one of them. The walls closed in, a chilling whisper echoing through the air. "Find him before it's too late." And then the lights went out again. I've spent the last 2 years working as a night security guard at the old lighthouse on Cliffside Point. The lighthouse had been guiding ships to safety for over a century, but it had been decommissioned after the last keeper disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Since then, the town had turned it into a historical site, with people coming to explore its rich history and ominous tales. On a foggy October evening, I arrived for my shift, the salty sea air swirling around me. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the cliffs. As I stepped inside the lighthouse, the wooden door creaked ominously behind me, sealing me in with the lingering stories of the past. My first round took me up the narrow spiral staircase that wound around the lighthouse's core. Each step echoed in the confined space, and the smell of seaweed and salt surrounded me. I reached the lantern room where the massive lens had once been lit to guide weary sailors. The glass was dusty, and the room felt cold, as if the ghosts of past keepers still lingered within. As I surveyed the room, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of light danced across the glass, illuminating the dark corners of the lantern room. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease creeping over me. It was just my imagination, I told myself. After a few uneventful hours, I took a break in the small office on the ground floor. I made myself a cup of coffee, trying to shake off the lingering chill. That's when I heard it. A soft, melodic humming echoing from the staircase. My heart raced. I knew I was alone in the lighthouse. I set my coffee down and walked toward the sound, curiosity pulling me forward. As I climbed the steps, the humming grew louder, more insistent. When I reached the lantern room again, the light flickered once more, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice shaky. The humming stopped abruptly, and an unnatural silence filled the air. I scanned the room, my flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. Just then, I caught sight of a figure standing in the far corner, half hidden in the darkness. It was a man dressed in old-fashioned clothing with a weathered face and deep-set eyes. "Help me," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "The lantern must be lit." I stumbled back, my heart racing. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to maintain my composure. "I am the keeper," he replied, stepping into the light. "I've been waiting for someone to take my place. The lighthouse must guide the ships again." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "You're the last keeper? But you disappeared years ago." He nodded, his expression filled with sorrow. "I was lost to the sea during a storm, but my spirit remains bound to this lighthouse. The lantern has not burned bright since my passing, and without it, many souls are at risk." I glanced at the dusty lantern, its glass clouded with age. "How can I help you?" "You must relight the lantern," he said, his voice growing fainter. "But be warned, dark forces linger in these waters. They will try to stop you." Determined to help him, I nodded. "I'll do it." I rushed to the lantern, my heart pounding in my chest. I found a small supply of oil and a long wick hidden in a nearby cabinet. The wind howled outside, sending shivers through the structure as I prepared the lantern. As I poured the oil into the base, I could feel a strange energy building in the room. The keeper watched silently, his eyes filled with hope. With trembling hands, I lit the wick, and the flame flickered to life, casting a warm glow across the room. The moment the lantern ignited, the air shifted, and I felt a rush of wind sweep through the lighthouse. The humming returned, but it was now a vibrant melody, filling the space with warmth and light. The keeper smiled, a look of peace washing over his face. "You've done it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You've set me free." As he spoke, the light from the lantern grew brighter, illuminating the entire room. I felt a surge of energy, and the shadows that had lingered in the corners began to dissipate. The keeper's form started to shimmer, and I could see the outline of a ship sailing through the waves outside the window. "Thank you," he said, his voice echoing as his figure began to fade. "The lighthouse is alive again." With that, he vanished, leaving behind a warm glow that enveloped me. The lantern shone brightly, casting its light across the cliffs and out to sea. I stood there, awestruck, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over me. From that night on, the lighthouse felt different. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose and vibrancy. I continued my shifts, but now the light from the lantern guided me, reminding me of the keeper's sacrifice and the stories that lingered within the walls. As I watched the sun rise over the horizon, casting golden rays across the water, I felt a connection to the sea and the souls it held. And every night, when I lit the lantern, I knew that I was not just a keeper of the lighthouse. I was a guardian of its stories, ensuring that the light would always shine for those who needed it most. I was a night security guard at the old Maple Grove Park, a sprawling area of woods and trails that had once been a popular destination for families. But after a series of mysterious disappearances, the park fell into disrepair, and the stories of the Whispering Woods spread like wildfire among the locals. They said the woods were alive, filled with spirits that called out to unsuspecting wanderers, leading them astray. Skeptical but intrigued, I took the job, hoping to uncover the truth behind the legends. The first few nights were uneventful, filled with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. But as the moon rose higher in the sky, a strange sensation crept over me, the feeling of being watched. One particularly eerie night in late autumn, I was making my rounds when I heard it. A soft whisper carried on the wind, barely audible but unmistakable. "Help! Help us!" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, but only silence filled the air. The whispering continued, a haunting melody that beckoned me deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, curiosity gnawing at me. As I ventured further, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the trunks. "Help us. Remember us." "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice trembling. "What do you need?" The wind picked up, swirling around me, and suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a young girl, no older than 10, with wild, tangled hair and a look of desperation in her eyes. "You have to help us," she pleaded, her voice filled with urgency. "Help you with what?" I asked, stepping closer, trying to make sense of the situation. "We're lost," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "We can't find our way home. The woods won't let us go." Panic surged through me as I realized the truth. The girl was one of the lost souls, trapped in the whispering woods. "What happened to you?" I asked gently. "We came here to play," she explained, her voice trembling. "But we wandered too far, and now we can't find our way back. We're scared." "Where are the others?" I asked, looking around for any sign of other children. "They're here," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear, "but the woods keep them hidden. You have to help us find them." Determined to help, I nodded. "Okay, let's find your friends, but you need to show me the way." As we walked deeper into the woods, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that tugged at my heart. "Help us! Help us!" they chanted, filling the air with sorrow. Suddenly the girl stopped, her expression shifting from fear to despair. "They're close," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't see them." "Stay close to me," I said, trying to keep my own fear at bay. "We'll find them together." I called out, hoping to reach the other lost souls. "If anyone is here, please come forward. We want to help you." The whispers intensified, swirling around us like a storm. Then, out of the shadows, I saw them, 3 more children, their faces pale and hollow. They looked lost and frightened, their eyes wide with despair. "We can't find our way home," one of them said, tears streaming down his face. "Don't worry," I said, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "We're going to get you out of here. Just follow me." As I led the children back through the woods, the whispers grew more frantic, swirling around us in a cacophony of voices. "Don't leave us! Help us!" they cried, and I could feel the weight of their sorrow pressing down on me. "Stay strong," I urged the children, glancing back at them. "We're almost there." But just as we reached the edge of the woods, the shadows thickened, and a figure blocked our path. A dark silhouette, its presence cold and menacing. "You can't leave," it hissed, the voice echoing with malice. Fear gripped me as I stood my ground, determination surging within me. "We have to go," I shouted, holding the children close. "You can't keep them here." The dark figure lunged forward, but I felt a surge of energy as the whispers grew louder, filling the air with warmth. "Remember us!" the voices cried, their strength bolstering my resolve. With a surge of courage, I stepped forward, facing the darkness head-on. "You can't have them!" I screamed, my voice rising above the whispers. "They belong to the light." In that moment, the air shimmered, and the shadows recoiled, the dark figure wavering before me. The children huddled closer, and I held my ground, feeling the warmth of their hope surrounding me. As I reached out my hand, the darkness shattered like glass, and the whispers transformed into a chorus of laughter. The children's faces lit up with joy, and I felt the woods begin to shift, the path clearing before us. "We can go," the little girl exclaimed, her eyes shining with hope. "Thank you." With renewed strength, we ran toward the edge of the woods, the whispers fading into the distance. The moonlight illuminated our path, guiding us back to safety. As we emerged from the trees, I turned to the children, tears of relief streaming down my face. "You did it," I said, my heart swelling with pride. "You're free." The children smiled, their faces brightening as they realized they were no longer lost. "Thank you," they chimed in unison, their laughter ringing like music in the air. I watched as they began to fade, their spirits finally at peace. "Remember," I said, my voice breaking with emotion, You are loved, and you will always be remembered." With one last smile, they vanished into the night, leaving me standing at the edge of the whispering woods. The weight of their sorrow lifted. From that night on, Maple Grove Park was no longer a place of fear. It became a sanctuary of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of woods, light and love can guide lost souls home. And every time the wind rustled through the trees, I could still hear their laughter, a testament to the bond that would never be broken. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and I've been the night security guard at the old Artistry Gallery for just under a year. The gallery had once been a vibrant hub for artists and art lovers alike, showcasing beautiful works from local talent. But after a series of unfortunate events, the sudden death of the gallery's beloved owner, a string of thefts and subsequent financial troubles, the gallery fell into disrepair, and its doors were shut to the public. The locals claimed the gallery was haunted by the spirit of a young artist named Clara, who had mysteriously vanished on the night of her first exhibition. They said she had poured her heart and soul into her work, only to be met with tragedy. Rumors swirled about her last painting, said to be hidden within the gallery, and that it held the key to understanding her fate. Despite the stories, I loved working the night shift. The silence of the gallery was serene, and I enjoyed wandering through the exhibition halls, admiring the art that still adorned the walls. But as the nights grew longer, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. One particularly stormy night, rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a restless spirit. I was making my rounds when I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails on canvas. My heart raced, and I followed the sound to the back of the gallery, where the lighting was dim. As I turned the corner, I was met with a shocking sight. A figure stood before an easel, her back to me, painting with swift, graceful strokes. My breath caught in my throat. It was a young woman, her hair cascading over her shoulders, absorbed in her work. "Excuse me?" I called out, but she didn't turn. The scratching sound continued as she painted, completely unaware of my presence. I stepped closer, but before I could say anything else, she turned, revealing her ethereal features and the deep sorrow in her eyes. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I'm Clara," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm trying to finish my painting." "Your painting?" I echoed, glancing at the canvas. It was a beautiful landscape, full of vibrant colors and swirling clouds, but there was something unsettling about it, an undercurrent of darkness that seemed to pull at the edges of the image. "Yes," she said, her gaze drifting back to the canvas. "It's the last piece I started before everything went wrong." "What happened to you?" I pressed, feeling a deep empathy for the artist before me. "I was so close to achieving my dreams," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But on the night of my exhibition, someone took it all from me. I never got to show my work, to say goodbye." The sadness in her voice wrapped around me like a dense fog. "But you're here now," I said gently. "You can still share your art." "I can't," she replied, shaking her head. "I'm trapped in this place, bound to my unfinished work. I need to complete this painting, but I don't have the strength." As she spoke, I felt a surge of determination. "Let me help you," I said. "We can finish it together." Clara looked at me, her expression shifting from despair to hope. "You would do that for me?" "Of course," I replied, moving closer to the easel. "Tell me what to do." With a nod, she guided my hand, showing me how to layer the colors and blend the strokes. As we painted together, I could feel her spirit flowing through me, her passion igniting a fire within. Each stroke brought the landscape to life, and I felt a connection to her artistry, her dreams. But as the painting neared completion, the atmosphere shifted. The shadows in the gallery grew darker, and I could sense a presence lurking at the edges of my vision. "Ethan, we must hurry," Clara urged, her voice tinged with urgency. "They don't want me to finish." "Who?" I asked, my heart racing. "The ones who took my life," she replied, her voice trembling. "They're still here, and they won't let me go." I glanced around the room, dread pooling in my stomach. I knew I had to finish the painting before whatever dark force was haunting the gallery could intervene. With renewed determination, I focused on the canvas, letting Clara's spirit guide my hand. Finally, with one last stroke, the painting was complete. The landscape was breathtaking, a vibrant blend of colors that seemed to pulse with life. But as I stepped back to admire our work, the lights flickered violently and the room grew cold. "No," Clara cried, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. "We did it. You have to let me go." "I won't let them take you," I shouted, feeling the cold air wrap around me like chains. "Trust in the light," she whispered, her voice fading. "You can break the curse." As darkness engulfed the room, I turned to the painting, and in that moment, I realized what I had to do. "You have to shine," I yelled, channeling all my energy into the artwork. Suddenly, the painting glowed with an intense light, illuminating the room and driving back the shadows. I could hear the anguished cries of the dark presence as it retreated, unable to withstand the brilliance of Clara's talent. And then, just as quickly as it began, it was over. The shadows dissipated, and Clara's spirit appeared before me one last time, her face radiant with gratitude. "Thank you, Ethan. You've set me free." As her form began to fade, I felt a warmth enveloping me, a sense of peace washing over the gallery. "I'll remember you," I promised, tears in my eyes. "Your art will live on." With her final smile, Clara vanished, leaving the gallery bathed in light. I stood before the painting, now a masterpiece, a testament to her passion and resilience. In the days that followed, I ensured that Clara's story was shared with the world. The artistry gallery reopened, showcasing her final work, and her spirit was celebrated by art lovers far and wide. Every night I returned to the gallery, I could feel her presence, a gentle reminder that art transcends even the darkest moments, bridging the gap between worlds and keeping the light alive. I've spent the last 6 months working as a night security guard at Maplewood Cabin, a cozy retreat nestled deep in the woods. Once a cherished getaway for families, it had fallen into disrepair after a tragic event. A fire that took the lives of a mother and her 2 children during a winter storm. Locals whispered about the cabin being haunted, claiming to hear the echoes of laughter and cries drifting through the trees at night. I took the job to escape the hustle and bustle of the city, seeking solace among the tall pines and serene lakes. I was skeptical of the ghost stories, but as the nights grew longer, a sense of unease settled in. There was something about the cabin that felt alive, as if it held its breath waiting. One particularly frigid night, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. I was making my rounds when I heard it, a soft giggle, followed by the sound of tiny footsteps padding across the wooden floor. My heart raced, half expecting to find a family enjoying a late-night snack. But when I entered the main room, I found it empty, the fire in the hearth crackling softly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. No answer came, just the sound of the wind outside. I shook my head, dismissing it as my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a flash of movement. Curiosity piqued, I stepped closer to investigate. That's when I noticed an old, dusty photo album lying open on the table. I took a seat and began flipping through its pages. The photographs revealed a happy family, smiling faces enjoying summers at the cabin, children playing by the lake, and the mother with a radiant smile. But as I turned the pages, the images became darker. The last few pictures were of the cabin engulfed in flames, smoke billowing into the night sky. My heart sank as I realized I was looking at the family who had perished in the fire. Just then, I heard the giggles again, this time louder and more distinct. They were coming from the upstairs loft. I stood up, heart pounding, and made my way up the creaking staircase. As I reached the top, the laughter faded, replaced by a soft humming. It was a lullaby, sweet and sorrowful. I followed the sound to a small bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open. Inside, the room was filled with a sense of warmth despite its disheveled state. Toys were scattered across the floor, and the window curtains fluttered gently, even though there was no breeze. In the corner, I saw a faint silhouette of a little girl, her long hair cascading down her back. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She turned to face me, her bright blue eyes shimmering with sadness. "I miss Mommy," she said softly. I felt a wave of empathy wash over me. "I'm sure she misses you too," I replied gently. "Do you want to tell me about her?" The little girl nodded, and as she began to speak, the room filled with the warmth of her memories. She talked about her mother's laughter, how she would sing songs and read bedtime stories. But then her expression shifted to one of fear. "But the fire, it took us away." The room grew colder, and I could feel a heaviness in the air. "You're safe now," I said, trying to comfort her. "But you need to let go. Your mother wants you to be happy." As I spoke those words, the shadows in the room thickened, and I could see the outline of another figure. A woman, her face etched with sorrow. It was the mother, her eyes filled with love and longing, as she reached out to her daughter. "Mommy," the little girl cried, rushing towards the figure, but as she reached her, the woman's face twisted in anguish. "I'm sorry, my love," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I couldn't save you." In that moment, I realized the truth. The mother was trapped in her own grief, unable to move on while her children lingered in the cabin. "You have to forgive yourself," I said, my voice steady. "You did everything you could." The mother's gaze met mine, and I could feel the weight of her sorrow. "But I failed them," she said, tears streaming down her face. "No, you didn't," I urged, "and they love you. They want you to be at peace." As I spoke, the atmosphere shifted. The little girl reached out for her mother, her small hand trembling. "I love you, Mommy. Please don't be sad." The mother's expression softened, and she knelt down to embrace her daughter. "I love you too, my sweet girl," she whispered, the warmth of her love enveloping them both. In that moment, the room filled with light, and I felt a wave of energy wash over me. The shadows retreated, and the air grew lighter. I watched as the figures of mother and daughter began to fade, their faces now serene. "Thank you," the mother said, her voice echoing in the wind. "Thank you for helping us find peace." As they disappeared, I felt a warmth enveloping me, a sense of calm washing over the cabin. The air was no longer heavy with sorrow. Instead, it felt alive with love and memories. From that night on, Maplewood Cabin was no longer a place of fear. It became a sanctuary of hope, a reminder that love transcends even the darkest of tragedies. I continued my shifts, but instead of dread, I felt a connection to the cabin and its past, a promise to remember the family and the love that endured beyond the flames. And every now and then, when the wind whispered through the trees, I could still hear the faint echoes of laughter, a testament to the bond that could never be broken. Last month, I decided to try something new for my channel. I set up a live stream from an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. It was one of those places with a history of eerie disappearances and bizarre occurrences. I'd heard all the stories, and admittedly, I was a bit of an adrenaline junkie when it came to scary stuff. The mansion was a colossal, decaying structure with broken windows and rotting floors. The first thing that struck me was the silence. I mean, it was dead silent, even though it was a windy night. I started the stream, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. My viewers were buzzing with excitement, and I was feeding off their energy. I wandered through the main hall, chatting with the stream, pointing out the dust-covered chandeliers and cracked walls. But then, I found something peculiar. An old wooden door in the basement, partially hidden behind a pile of debris. It had no handle, just a keyhole. I figured it would make a good piece for the stream, so I started focusing on it. That's when things started to get strange. The chat went wild with comments about feeling something in the basement, but I brushed it off as typical horror tropes. Then, while examining the door, I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping coming from inside. My viewers noticed it too. They were practically screaming at me to open the door. I tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the door had a mind of its own. I decided to take a break, and that's when the lights flickered. I thought it was just a power issue, but then the stream cut out. My heart was racing, and I tried to reboot everything, but my equipment was acting up. I was on my own. I went back to the basement with just my flashlight. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was even more oppressive. My phone was still streaming, but it was silent, showing nothing but darkness. I aimed my flashlight at the door and something caught my eye, a dark, shadowy figure peering through the keyhole. I froze. The figure seemed to be staring right at me, and I could feel its gaze, cold and heavy. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. I tried to call for help, but my phone was dead. The tapping resumed, louder and more frantic this time. I ran up the stairs, my heart pounding. The front door was jammed, like it was being held shut from the outside. I kicked and shoved, finally bursting out into the night. I didn't stop running until I was far from the mansion, my viewers still watching the live feed, confused and frightened. Here's where it gets really unsettling. When I finally got back to my computer, I checked the stream's recording. The footage was intact, but there was something different about it. The live feed had captured a shadowy figure moving behind me, but it wasn't visible to my naked eye at the time. I reviewed the footage frame by frame, and that's when I saw it. The door had been slowly opening during the live stream. Not just any opening, but as if something, or someone, was trying to get out. And as the door creaked open, a pale, distorted face appeared, staring directly at the camera. But that's not even the worst part. The final frames of the stream showed the figure moving towards me, its face twisted into a grotesque, silent scream. I felt like I was being watched every moment since then, and I haven't been able to sleep without the lights on. Now here's the twist. I didn't tell you everything. I mentioned that the mansion was on the outskirts of town, but that's not entirely true. The mansion was actually right behind my house. I didn't realize it until I reviewed the footage and saw my own backyard in the background of the mansion's windows. So if you're wondering why I've been so off lately, it's because whatever was in that mansion, it's not gone. It's still here. And sometimes, when I look out the window at night, I think I see that same pale face watching me from the shadows. I always had a fascination with the eerie and the unexplained. When I found an old map in a dusty antique shop, one that led to a forgotten cabin in the woods, I knew I had to check it out. The map was tattered and the ink was fading, but it showed a secluded spot marked with a crude drawing of a cabin. After days of planning and preparing, I finally found myself driving down a gravel road that seemed to get narrower with every mile. The forest loomed on either side, trees like silent sentinels. Eventually, I parked my truck and set off on foot, guided only by the map and my own growing sense of unease. The cabin appeared just as described, a derelict structure with sagging walls and a roof that looked like it might collapse any minute. I pushed open the creaking door, and the musty smell of decay hit me like a wall. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing an interior that hadn't been touched in decades. Dust-covered furniture, a fireplace choked with cobwebs, and a grand piano that looked like it hadn't played a note in years. I started exploring, filming as I went. I wanted to capture every detail for my viewers. But it wasn't long before I began to feel like I wasn't alone. At first, it was just the creaking of the floorboards, the sounds of the cabin settling. But then, I started hearing something else. Whispers. Soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from all around me. I kept my cool, telling myself it was just the wind or my imagination. I decided to check out the basement. The stairs creaked ominously under my weight as I descended into the darkness. The air was colder here and the whispers grew louder, though they still made no sense. I shone my flashlight around and saw strange symbols etched into the walls, symbols that looked disturbingly like runes. As I continued to explore, the whispers grew clearer. They started forming words, pleas for help, urgent and desperate. I could hear them calling my name now. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to reach me. I retraced my steps to the main floor, but the feeling of being watched was now overwhelming. My camera's battery, which had been full when I arrived, was now dangerously low. I was about to call it a night and head back when I noticed something odd. On a dusty shelf there was an old photograph. It was a group of people, their faces obscured by age, standing in front of the very cabin I was in. One figure, however, was eerily familiar. It was a man who looked exactly like me. My heart raced. I had no idea who these people were, but the resemblance was uncanny. I began to feel lightheaded and dizzy, as if the very air around me was thickening. I stumbled back to the door, but it wouldn't open. It felt as though it was being held shut from the other side. Panic set in. I turned back to the cabin, searching for another exit. The whispers had turned into loud, urgent voices now, calling my name, begging me to stay. I ran to the window, but the forest outside seemed to have transformed. The trees were no longer familiar. They were twisted, gnarled, and seemed to shift and move. In a final act of desperation, I grabbed a piece of firewood and smashed a window, crawling out into the night. I sprinted through the forest, the whispers now a deafening roar behind me. When I finally made it back to my truck, I didn't stop to breathe. I sped down the gravel road, barely noticing where I was going. It wasn't until I reached the safety of the streetlights that I finally allowed myself to calm down. I checked the footage on my camera, hoping for some kind of evidence, something that could explain what I'd just been through. But there was nothing. The footage had all been erased. All that remained was the photograph I had found, which was now inexplicably on my camera roll. I zoomed in on the figure that looked like me. Beneath it, in faded ink, were the words, "Welcome home." I never went back to that cabin, and I haven't done any more explorations since. Some mysteries are best left unsolved, and some places are best left undisturbed. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the scariest places are the ones you least expect. Stay safe out there. I've always had a fascination with nature photography. I spent countless weekends exploring the remote areas of the Pacific Northwest, capturing the beauty of the wilderness through my lens. In the summer of 2024, I stumbled upon a hidden gem, a picturesque lake tucked away in a dense forest rumored to be haunted. The locals called it Whispering Lake, claiming it held the spirits of those who had drowned in its depths. Intrigued, I decided to spend a weekend camping by the water, hoping to catch the perfect sunset shot. The atmosphere was serene, with the sun casting golden hues across the surface. As I set up my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That first night, as I settled down to sleep, the sounds of the forest filled the air, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the wind. But there was something else, an eerie whisper that seemed to come from the lake itself. "Sarah, Sarah." It echoed softly, like a distant call. I brushed it off as my imagination, but the feeling of unease lingered. The next morning I woke before dawn, eager to capture the first light over the water. As I approached the lake, the fog hung low, shrouding the landscape in mystery. I set up my camera, framing the shot, when I noticed something strange, a reflection in the water that didn't match my surroundings. In the lake, I saw a girl, pale with long dark hair flowing around her like tendrils of smoke. She stared back at me, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Help me," she mouthed silently. I stumbled back, heart racing. Was this a trick of the light or something more sinister? Determined to uncover the truth, I spent the day exploring the area, asking locals about the lake and its legends. They spoke of a young girl named Emily, who had drowned decades ago while swimming with friends. Her spirit was said to linger, forever searching for a way to communicate with the living. That night, I returned to the lake, feeling drawn to the water. The moonlight shimmered on the surface, and the whispers returned, more insistent. "Sarah, help me." I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached the edge. The water was eerily calm, and I could see the reflection of the girl again, clearer this time. "Who are you?" I called out, hoping to break the silence. "What do you want?" "I'm lost," she replied, though her lips didn't move. "I need you to find my locket. It's the key to my freedom." Fear clawed at my throat, but curiosity kept me anchored to the spot. "Where is it?" I asked. "In the depths," she whispered, the water behind her swirling as if beckoning me closer. "Under the oak tree, at the bottom." My heart raced as I considered my next move. I couldn't ignore her plea. I promised to help, but as I turned to leave, I felt a tug at my ankle. I looked down to see a shadowy hand emerging from the water, grasping fiercely. Panic surged through me, and I yanked my foot away, stumbling back. "I'll find it," I shouted, desperation coursing through me. I retreated to my tent, heart pounding, but sleep eluded me. The whispers followed me into the night, wrapping around me like a shroud. The next day I returned to the lake armed with a diving mask and snorkel. I had to know the truth. As I submerged into the cold water, the world above faded away, replaced by a surreal underwater landscape. I swam deeper, searching beneath the roots of the old oak tree that stood at the water's edge. Then I saw it, a glint of gold buried in the silt. I reached down, fingers brushing against the locket. Pulling it free, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. As I surfaced, the whispers grew louder, turning frantic. "You have it! Now come back!" I gasped for air, my heart racing as I clutched the locket. Just then the water erupted and the girl's figure emerged, her face twisted in anguish. "You must give it to me. It's mine." Her voice echoed, filled with desperation. "Why? What will you do with it?" I shouted, fear gripping my heart. "It will free me," she cried, her form shimmering in the moonlight. "But you must trust me." Before I could respond, she lunged for me, her icy fingers wrapping around my wrist. I felt the chill seep into my bones, and panic surged through me. In that moment, clarity washed over me. I realized I was being manipulated. The locket was not just a key to her freedom, it was a trap meant to ensnare my soul. "No," I screamed, yanking my arm away. I held the locket tightly, feeling its warmth against my palm. "You can't have it." With a surge of adrenaline, I dove back under the water, aiming for the depths. The shadows swirled around me, clawing at my legs, but I swam with all my might. I could feel the girl's rage building, the water growing colder as I fought to break free. Finally, bursting to the surface, I hurled the locket into the center of the lake, watching as it sank beneath the waves. The whispers turned to screams, echoing through the night. "No, you've doomed me." Clara's form flickered and twisted, her face contorted in rage and despair. The water churned violently, and I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I felt the pull of the lake, but I forced myself to turn and run back to my tent. I could hear the wails of the spirits, the sound piercing the night. I packed my belongings in a frenzy, desperate to escape the haunting presence of Whispering Lake. As I drove away, the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over the landscape. I glanced back at the lake, now calm and peaceful. But I knew better. I had severed the connection between the girl and her locket, but the spirits of the lake would continue to whisper their secrets to anyone brave or foolish enough to listen. Though I had escaped, I could still feel the weight of their sorrow lingering in my heart. I promised myself I would never return, but as I drove away, I couldn't help but wonder, what would become of the next soul drawn to Whispering Lake? Let me take you back to last month. I inherited an old house from my great-aunt, a place I'd visited as a kid but never really spent much time in. It's an old Victorian-style home, full of creaky floors and dusty antiques. It had been empty for years, and when I moved in, I knew I'd have my work cut out for me, but I was excited to start fresh in a place with so much history. While unpacking, I discovered a peculiar room that had been sealed off. I found the door behind a heavy draped curtain in the attic, covered in dust and cobwebs. The door was old, with a rusty padlock securing it. I was curious but also a bit uneasy. My great-aunt was always a bit mysterious, and she never mentioned this room. One night I decided to investigate. I managed to pry open the padlock with some effort, and the door creaked open, revealing a room that had clearly been untouched for decades. Inside, it was dimly lit by the light from my flashlight, and the air was thick with dust. The room was filled with old furniture draped in white sheets, and the scent of mildew was overpowering. I set up my camera to record, figuring it might be interesting to share with my followers. The atmosphere was eerie, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. I explored the room, noting old photographs on the walls and an ancient-looking mirror that was covered with a sheet. There was a strange sense of stillness, like time had stopped there. As I was about to wrap up and leave, I noticed something odd. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and my breath became visible in the cold air. The camera picked up a faint, shadowy figure moving across the far wall. I thought it was a trick of the light or my imagination, but then I heard it. A faint whisper, like someone was trying to speak through the walls. I tried to capture it on camera, but the whisper was too soft. I felt a chill run down my spine and decided to investigate further. I walked over to the mirror, which I had avoided until now. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, but I saw something scratched into the surface. "Help me." The room seemed to close in on me. My flashlight flickered, and the shadows grew darker. I was about to leave when I noticed a hidden door behind a bookcase. It was almost as if the bookcase was a secret passage. I pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. Against my better judgment, I descended. The stairs creaked ominously under my weight, and the air grew colder with each step. I reached the bottom and found myself in a small, dimly lit chamber with old, dusty furniture and a single candle on a small table. The room was eerily silent. On the table was a journal, its pages yellowed with age. I opened it and began reading. The journal belonged to a woman who had lived in the house in the early 1900s. Her entries detailed increasing paranoia, strange noises, and a sense of being watched. The last entry was particularly unsettling. "I'm trapped here. The walls are closing in. They won't let me leave." As I read that last entry, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. The candle flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled up the stairs, my heart racing. When I reached the attic, I saw that the door to the sealed room was closed tight again, as if it had never been opened. Here's the twist that still haunts me. I reviewed the footage from the camera, and there was a moment, just a brief second, where the reflection in the mirror showed someone standing behind me. It was a woman, her face twisted in fear. And in the background, the journal entries I read about the sealed room's history were identical to the ones in my great-aunt's old records. Records I didn't even know existed. It's been weeks since that night, and I still feel the presence of that woman. I sometimes hear whispers in the house, and the temperature drops unexpectedly. I've tried to convince myself it's all in my head, but deep down I know something sinister is connected to that room. And the more I uncover, the more I feel like I'm being drawn into the very nightmare I thought I had escaped. Thanks for listening, everyone. If you've ever felt like something was following you, or you've encountered a place that seemed to defy reality, leave a comment below. Maybe you can help me make sense of this. Stay safe, and remember, some doors are better left closed.